I have watched football my entire life, from the glare of stadium lights to the hushed tension of locker rooms before the first snap. I have celebrated the triumphs, felt the roar of the crowd, and believed in the narrative of the sport as a grand theater of human achievement. But as I dug deeper into the history of the NFL, I realized there was a side to the league that fans rarely see. A side that shadows every touchdown, every cheer, every Super Bowl moment. It is the story of ownership, of power concentrated in the hands of a few men, and of the human cost paid by the players whose labor built the empire. It is a history of exploitation hidden beneath the surface of the sport's glory, and it begins from the very foundation of the league. From the earliest days of professional football, owners have wielded authority with an almost absolute hand. Men like George Halas, Art Rooney, Tim Mara, and others were visionaries in the business sense. Creating dynasties, attracting fans, and turning modest games into a national obsession. But their vision came at a cost that fell squarely on the men who suited up and took the field. Players were rarely treated as human beings. They were assets, commodities to be managed, moved, and, when convenient, discarded. Contracts were written with the protection of owners in mind, with clauses that allowed termination for minor infractions or injuries, while guarantees for the player's health, security, or long-term well-being were minimal to non-existent. I first became aware of this history when I stumbled across an early 1950s dispute between players and the league. The players had begun to understand that they were generating the wealth, fame, and fan loyalty that the owners banked upon. Yet, when injury struck or performance declined, there was no safety net. They were told to play through pain, stay silent, be grateful, while the owners expanded stadiums, negotiated broadcast contracts, and increased profits without accounting for the human toll. It struck me then, as it strikes me now, that the foundation of professional football was not only skill and competition, but also a subtle, pervasive system of control and exploitation. The league thrived on this dynamic. Players were celebrated publicly, held up as heroes, and idolized by millions. Yet their autonomy was restricted. Free agency was curtailed. Salary negotiations were constrained, and medical care was often inadequate. The early decades of the NFL were defined by labor struggles that were largely invisible to the public, but which shaped the lives of every athlete who dared to step onto a field. Owners resisted unionization efforts, colluded to limit salaries, and maintained control over contracts that left players with little power to protect themselves. In the stories I uncovered, the human cost is undeniable. Mike Webster, a Hall of Fame center, spent his post-career years in extreme hardship, struggling with injuries, homelessness, and early death. His story is not unique, is one of many, repeated through generations of players whose physical and mental health was compromised by the very system that profited from their efforts. These are not abstract statistics. These are lives, families, and futures reshaped by a league that has historically prioritized profit over welfare. Financial exploitation extended beyond contracts. Stadium deals, relocation decisions, and revenue-sharing agreements were crafted to maximize the owner's wealth. Cities were persuaded to fund stadiums, often with public money, while players received little long-term benefit. Broadcast contracts multiplied revenue exponentially, yet the players' share remained disproportionately small. Even the branding and image of the league was controlled to enhance ownership advantage. Players were the public face, but the narrative, the leverage, and the ultimate financial control belonged to those behind closed doors. And yet, the exploitation was never always obvious. It was subtle, often hidden within the rules, within the culture, and within the language of the game. Players were taught resilience, toughness, and loyalty, but rarely taught how to protect themselves within a system designed to extract maximum value from their labor. They were pushed to perform through pain, to prioritize the game above their own health, and to accept decisions made for them without consultation. I have listened to former players describe the feeling of being a pawn in a game they did not design. of realizing that the heroism celebrated on Sundays masked a deeper reality of vulnerability and exposure. Early examples of labor suppression are chilling in retrospect. In the 1950s and 1960s, players who attempted to advocate for better conditions or challenge contract terms were met with collusion, blacklisting, or financial intimidation. Owners leveraged their authority across multiple teams to ensure that dissent was discouraged. Free agency, when it emerged decades later, was hard-won through struggle, strikes, and legal battles. And yet, even after victories, the structural imbalance between ownership and players remains stark. The system was designed to favor capital over labor, to reward those who controlled resources while minimizing risk for the very people whose labor generated it. Medical exploitation is another central thread in this narrative. For decades, injuries, particularly concussions, were treated as inconveniences rather than threats to long-term health. Players were cleared to return to the field after hits that today would warrant extended medical observation. Brain trauma, spinal injuries, and chronic pain were endemic. Yet the policies and medical staff often served ownership priorities first, player welfare second. It was not until the tragic post-career experiences of athletes like Mike Webster, Jr., and countless others that the league began to acknowledge the connection between repeated injuries and degenerative diseases, such as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. Even then, the acknowledgement came after decades of denial, lawsuits, and public pressure, not from moral responsibility, but from necessity. The human impact of these policies cannot be overstated. I have interviewed former players who described their post-career lives in terms of loss, betrayal, and isolation. They made money off our sweat, our pain, our broken bodies, one player told me. But if we protested, if we tried to assert our rights, we were disposable. That sense of disposability, that recognition that the system valued them for their productivity and nothing else, is a recurring theme throughout NFL history. The story of ownership is inseparable from the story of exploitation, because one cannot exist without the other. Even in the modern era, where billion-dollar franchises dominate the landscape and player salaries reach unprecedented heights, the fundamental dynamics remain similar. Owners maintain control over relocation, revenue, contracts, and media narratives. Players have more leverage than ever before, but structural inequities persist. Mega deals, stadium negotiations, and broadcast contracts continue to disproportionately enrich owners while leaving the human cost on the athlete's shoulders. Injuries, short career spans, and long-term health consequences remain part of the landscape. The echoes of early exploitation resonate clearly in the modern game. As I reflect on these decades of history, I realize that this is not a simple story of villains and victims. Some owners invested in communities, improved player facilities, and contributed positively to the league. Some modern reforms have improved safety protocols and compensation structures. Yet, the overarching pattern is undeniable. Wealth and power are concentrated in ownership, and the human cost is largely borne by the players. Understanding this is essential to understanding the full story of professional football. In this documentary, I will take you through decades of triumph and tragedy. We will explore the earliest days of the NFL, when players had little protection and owners exercised nearly unchecked power. We will examine labor battles, collusion, and strikes that challenged the system. We will delve into medical neglect, concussion crises, and the long-term consequences of owner-driven decision-making. We will look at financial control, stadium deals, relocations, and the manipulation of media narratives. And through it all, we will hear the voices of those who lived it, the players, their families, and the historians who have pieced together the hidden truths of the league. This is more than a story about football. It is a story about power, responsibility, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. It is a story about the human lives that underpin an empire of spectacle and profit. The players made the game legendary. The owners made it profitable. And the gap between the two, the cost of creation, the sacrifices, the injuries, and the broken dreams is the dark side of ownership that I aim to reveal. The history of exploitation is not a sidebar or a footnote. It is embedded in the foundation of the NFL. It is present in every draft, every contract, every trade, and every labor negotiation. And only by confronting it can we fully understand what has been at stake for the men who gave everything to a game that has historically rewarded wealth and power over human welfare. I've spent years tracing the history of professional football, following the stories that rarely make it into highlight reels or stadium celebrations. I've spoken to players who lived through eras of blatant inequity, historians who have pieced together decades of hidden records, and families whose lives were irrevocably shaped by decisions made in offices far from the field. From the earliest days of the NFL, there is a recurring truth. The players have always been the lifeblood of the game, and the owners have always been the architects of the system that controlled them. Understanding the dark side of ownership is essential to understanding the league itself. When the NFL began in 1920, it was not yet the cultural juggernaut it is today. Teams were small, regional, and often precariously funded. Owners like George Halas of the Chicago Bears, Art Rooney of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Tim Mara of the New York Giants were pioneers, but their pioneering spirit was largely focused on profit and survival rather than player welfare. Players were underpaid, overworked, and subject to rules that limited their agency. Contracts were drafted with clauses that heavily favored owners, allowing for the termination of agreements at minimal cost, often with little explanation or compensation. The men who took the field were the most visible part of the league, yet they were granted the least amount of power over the conditions under which they played. I've reviewed archival contracts and documentation that illustrate the imbalance. Players could be benched, traded, or released on a whim, with no recourse beyond personal negotiation or legal challenge. Salaries were often insufficient to sustain a family, and off-season jobs were a necessity for most. Injuries were treated as inconveniences rather than threats, and medical care was often contingent on the owner's discretion. In many ways, the player's position was defined by vulnerability. They were expendable assets, and their labor was the currency of the league's growth. Labor unrest was inevitable. The first players to challenge ownership in the 1950s and 1960s faced a system that was structurally resistant to negotiation. Collusion between owners to suppress salaries, blacklisting of outspoken athletes, and the manipulation of free agency rules were all part of a calculated strategy to maintain control. Players' attempts to unionize were met with resistance that extended across multiple franchises, illustrating the lengths to which owners would go to preserve dominance. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a systemic framework designed to prioritize profit and authority above welfare and fairness. The struggle for labor rights was not only about money, it was about respect, safety, and agency. I have spoken with former players who described the psychological weight of being controlled in every aspect of their careers. One veteran recalled, "We were taught to be grateful for our place, but the gratitude was one-sided. We gave our bodies and our lives, and they took it as standard practice, not as a moral responsibility." That sentiment echoes throughout NFL history. The league was built on physical and emotional sacrifice, and ownership reaped the rewards with calculated precision. Medical negligence has been one of the most profound areas of exploitation. For decades, players were cleared to return to games despite concussions, spinal injuries, and chronic pain that today would be considered career-threatening. The league's medical practices historically prioritized the game and the owner's profit over the long-term health of its players. The stories of men like Mike Webster, Junior Seau, and countless others exemplify the human cost of this system. Webster's post-career life, filled with homelessness, cognitive decline, and eventual death, was emblematic of the hidden consequences of a league that profited immensely while offering minimal protection or compensation. The neglect was not necessarily malicious, but it was systemic, and the repercussions have been devastating. Financial exploitation extended beyond individual contracts. Stadium deals, relocation, and media rights negotiations created enormous windfalls for owners, while offering limited returns for the athletes themselves. Public funds were often used to subsidize stadium construction. Yet the players, the primary generators of revenue, saw little of this investment translate into long-term security. Broadcast contracts magnified profits exponentially. Yet labor agreements often lagged behind, leaving players to negotiate for a fraction of the wealth they produced. Every revenue decision reinforced the structural imbalance between ownership and the workforce upon which the league relied. Racial and socioeconomic inequities also played a role. From the early years, opportunities for black players were limited. And when they were allowed to join the league, they often faced discriminatory contracts, restricted roles, and overt bias. Owners wielded power not only over pay, but over opportunity itself, shaping who could succeed and under what conditions. This systemic exclusion compounded the vulnerabilities faced by marginalized players and highlighted the broader dynamics of control and exploitation inherent in ownership structures. The NFL's pattern of relocation and expansion offers another lens into ownership's priorities. Teams moved cities with minimal consultation with players, fans, or local communities. The Rams, Raiders, and Chargers are just a few examples where decisions about relocation were made to maximize profit or access better markets, with little regard for human cost. Players had to uproot their lives, families, and routines, while owners negotiated billion-dollar deals that enriched themselves disproportionately. The narrative of loyalty, both to players and to fans, often clashed with the economic imperatives of ownership, revealing the underlying exploitative mechanisms. Throughout the league's history, legal battles have further exposed the imbalance of power. Antitrust suits, labor disputes, and concussion-related lawsuits have demonstrated how ownership has historically leveraged legal and institutional authority to protect wealth and limit accountability. Players who challenged these structures often faced prolonged legal struggles, while owners retained the resources to weather the pressure with minimal disruption to their financial or operational goals. These legal battles underscore the broader theme of structural exploitation. Power is concentrated. Accountability is limited, and the human cost is externalized. Even in the modern era, with players earning multi-million-dollar contracts, the dynamics of ownership exploitation persist, albeit in evolved forms. Mega deals, media control, and collective bargaining agreements continue to favor owners while placing the burden of risk on players. Injuries remain a constant concern. Career longevity is limited, and the psychological toll of fame and performance pressure persists. The systemic patterns that shaped the early NFL still echo today, reminding us that the league's financial and cultural success has always been intertwined with the subordination of its labor force. Throughout this documentary, I will guide you through these decades of history with a focus on the human stories behind the headlines. We will examine the lives of players who endured physical and emotional suffering, the strategies owners employed to consolidate wealth and control, and the slow evolution of labor, rights, and protections. We will hear from former athletes, family members, journalists, and historians, all contributing pieces to a narrative that is both historically grounded and emotionally resonant. We will explore the early years when ownership dictated nearly every aspect of a player's life. We will trace labor struggles that reshaped contracts, unionization efforts, and free agency rules. We will investigate the medical negligence that led to chronic injuries and untold suffering, and the financial strategies that ensured owners reaped the rewards of player labor, while offering minimal compensation or protection. We will examine racial and socioeconomic inequities, relocation controversies, and the persistent imbalance of power that defines the league. This is a story about more than football. It is about power and responsibility. It is about the human cost of entertainment and spectacle. The league's triumphs, its record-breaking contracts, and its cultural dominance cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the hidden ledger of exploitation that lies behind every success. The players built the game, the fans celebrated it, and the owners profited often at the direct expense of the very men who made it possible. By the end of this documentary, you will have witnessed the full arc of NFL ownership's history, from the formation of the league through the modern era of billion-dollar franchises. You will understand how labor was historically undervalued, how medical and financial systems were structured to protect owners, and how players have fought for recognition, rights, and safety against formidable opposition. And you will see how these patterns, though evolved, continue to shape the modern NFL and the lives of its athletes. The narrative of the NFL is incomplete without confronting this truth. Ownership has always been a central force, shaping not just the league's fortunes, but the lives of the players who brought it to prominence. The stories of courage, endurance, and advocacy are inseparable from the stories of exploitation, neglect, and imbalance. It is in the tension between these forces that the true history of the league emerges. Understanding this history is not only an exercise in reflection, it is essential to understanding the present. Every contract, every labor negotiation, every relocation decision, and every media deal carries echoes of this history. The dynamics of power, wealth, and human cost that were established nearly a century ago continue to influence the league today, affecting players, communities, and the culture of the sport itself. As we embark on this journey, I ask you to listen closely. Listen to the voices of players who endured injuries without adequate care. Listen to the families and communities impacted by ownership decisions. Listen to the historians and journalists who have reconstructed these hidden narratives from the fragments left behind. And understand that the story of ownership exploitation is not a sidebar to the game, is central to its history, its culture, and its ongoing evolution. By tracing this history, we will uncover patterns of control, profit, and human cost that reveal the NFL in a light rarely seen, but always present. And through these stories, you will come to understand the true weight of the game that triumphs, the sacrifices, and the systemic exploitation that has shaped the league from its earliest days. I remember reading an old newspaper clipping from 1921, yellowed and fragile, detailing a game between the Decatur Staleys and the Chicago Cardinals. The words themselves were simple, reporting scores and player performance, but beneath them lay a story of ambition, control, and the earliest forms of exploitation in professional football. The league was barely 2 years old, yet the seeds of an enduring power dynamic were already in place. The players were assets, and the owners were architects of a system designed to maximize their authority and profit. George Halas, Art Rooney, and Tim Mara, names now synonymous with the NFL, were more than visionaries of sport. They were businessmen, tacticians, and, in many ways, absolute rulers of the leagues they helped create. Halas, in Chicago, turned the Staleys into a powerhouse, while simultaneously controlling every facet of his players' contracts, conduct, and medical treatment. Art Rooney, in Pittsburgh, carefully built the Steelers with limited resources, but every decision, from who played to what they were paid, was firmly under his authority. Tim Mara, in New York, maintained strict oversight of the Giants, dictating terms that players were expected to follow without negotiation. These men laid the foundation for an enduring structure in which ownership power was nearly absolute. From my research, it became clear that early contracts were almost always skewed in favor of the owners. Players were signed for minimal salaries, often with clauses allowing instant termination for injury, perceived underperformance, or any behavior deemed unacceptable by management. I found examples where a single injury could result in the immediate loss of pay or housing, with no recourse or protection. Unlike modern contracts, there were no guaranteed salaries, pensions, or health provisions. The labor force the players were visible, celebrated, and glorified in public, but privately, they were entirely beholden to the whims of ownership. The psychological weight of such control was immense. I spoke with historians who explained that players were acutely aware of their expendability. One described the era as a constant negotiation with authority, where a misstep could end a career instantly. This was not simply about discipline or professionalism. It was systemic. Owners wielded authority not as a managerial tool, but as a mechanism to concentrate power, ensuring that all financial and operational leverage remained in their hands. The players' labor generated the spectacle, and the owners harvested the profits. In these early decades, player welfare was minimal. Injuries were treated as inconveniences rather than threats to longevity or quality of life. Team positions were often beholden to owners, expected to prioritize the team's immediate performance over the long-term health of a player. Knees, shoulders, and heads were treated with superficial care. Recovery was short, pain was expected, and players who could not endure were replaced. In examining archival medical reports, I found that some injuries were deliberately downplayed in official records to maintain the perception that players were resilient, reliable, and perpetually available. The invisible ledger of human cost-broken bodies, long-term trauma, was ignored. Even on the field, control was absolute. Owners dictated schedules, dictated travel arrangements, and often controlled access to essential equipment and facilities. Players were rarely given autonomy over training, medical treatment, or lifestyle. One veteran recounted that during the 1930s, it was common for an injured player to be pressured to play through severe pain under the threat of immediate termination. You either played, he said, or your career was over. It was a blunt form of coercion, but it was normalized by the era's culture and by the structure of ownership authority. Financial exploitation extended beyond salary alone. Owners controlled bonus structures, housing arrangements, and even off-season employment opportunities. Many players were forced to take additional jobs just to survive, while the league continued to profit from the public spectacle they created. In one striking example, a team would advertise player appearances and local events to generate extra income, but none of the proceeds were guaranteed to the athletes themselves. The labor was visible, celebrated, and profitable, but the compensation system systematically favored those who owned the league. I discovered that the early NFL also relied heavily on public perception as a tool of control. Players were portrayed as local heroes and national celebrities, yet their power to influence contracts or challenge ownership was almost non-existent. Media coverage, even in the 1920s and 1930s, often celebrated the feats of athletes while remaining silent on the inequities behind the scenes. Ownership cultivated an image of generosity, mentorship, and paternal care. Yet behind the stadium walls, the reality was far harsher. The player's status as heroes was a carefully managed narrative, one that reinforced loyalty while masking exploitation. Racial and socioeconomic disparities compounded the problem. In the early league, black players faced informal quotas, overt discrimination, and restricted roles on the field. Socioeconomic background often determined access to teams, training, and even visibility to scouts. Those from disadvantaged backgrounds were particularly vulnerable to exploitation, as they had fewer alternatives and little leverage. Owners could offer minimal compensation, knowing the players had few other options. This intersection of race, class, and labor exploitation created layers of systemic inequity that would echo for decades. The league's very structure reinforced control. Teams were localized, markets were tightly managed, and revenue streams were closely monitored. Owners collaborated across franchises to ensure that labor challenges were contained. I found records indicating that salary collusion and contract standardization were early practices designed to limit player leverage. The league was already a business, and from the beginning, the architecture of power favored those at the top. Players could aspire to fame, but control, authority, and profit were concentrated firmly in ownership hands. The economic pressures of the Great Depression also magnified the imbalance. Owners were expected to maintain solvency while players struggled to survive on minimal wages. During this time, some teams offered housing or food as part of compensation, not out of benevolence, but as a cost-saving mechanism. The financial safety of the players was secondary to the survival and growth of the franchise. These early economic pressures reinforced the notion that players existed primarily to generate revenue and spectacle, not to enjoy fair or secure working conditions. Beyond economics, there was a cultural expectation of obedience and endurance. Football in the early NFL was brutal, often more so than today. Protective equipment was rudimentary, medical knowledge was limited, and the rules allowed far more physical risk. Owners, aware of the spectacle's draw, tolerated this risk, encouraged it even, knowing that the pain and injuries of players enhanced the drama and excitement of the game. Yet, when those same injuries became permanent or career-ending, the responsibility and cost fell almost entirely on the athlete. I also found that ownership influence extended into post-career trajectories. Players had little support for transitioning out of football, and pensions or retirement programs were minimal. Careers were short, injuries were lasting, and opportunities outside the league were often scarce. The human cost of ownership decisions was not limited to the field. It followed players into every aspect of life, shaping their health, finances, and families. The pattern was clear. Owners reaped benefits from the labor and spectacle of the players, while maintaining minimal responsibility for their welfare beyond the immediate performance period. Despite these harsh realities, the early players showed remarkable resilience. They endured grueling schedules, physical punishment, and economic insecurity because of their love of the game, their drive for excellence, and the narrow opportunities available to them. In interviews I've studied, many recalled a sense of pride and camaraderie, even in the face of exploitation. That resilience is part of the story, but it does not erase the structural inequities imposed by ownership. The contrast between player sacrifice and owners' control is the lens through which the early NFL must be understood. Ownership's control was also strategic. Decisions about team expansion, scheduling, and competition were made with long-term revenue and stability in mind. Players had little influence, yet bore the immediate risk and workload. The league's growth was intertwined with exploitation. The more profitable the league became, the more power owners accumulated, and the more dependent players became on the very structures that limited their autonomy. The early years of the NFL, then, are defined not only by athletic achievement, but by the persistent imbalance of power. Every game, every transaction, and every contract was a negotiation of power, favoring those who owned the franchise. Players were indispensable, yet largely powerless, celebrated publicly, but constrained privately. Owners built dynasties on the labor, health, and sacrifices of men whose contributions were essential, but whose authority was systematically limited. Understanding these dynamics is crucial to understanding the foundation of the league and the structural patterns of exploitation that would continue for decades. Early NFL ownership established a pattern that is still recognizable today: centralization of authority, prioritization of profit, management of risk onto the labor force, and a public narrative that glorifies achievement while minimizing human cost. These patterns, seeded in the 1920s and 1930s, would shape decades of labor relations, medical policies, financial negotiations, and cultural expectations in ways that continue to reverberate. The story of early NFL ownership is, ultimately, a story of power and its consequences. It is a story of ambition and vision, but also of systemic exploitation, human cost, and structural imbalance. And it is the foundation upon which every subsequent chapter of labor, struggle, medical crisis, and financial negotiation would be built. From the very beginning of the NFL, the relationship between players and owners was defined by an unbalanced power dynamic. I have spent countless hours poring over archival records, oral histories, and legal documents that reveal the lengths to which owners went to maintain control over labor while maximizing profits. The early players, those who paved the way for modern professional football, were treated as indispensable yet disposable. They were the engine of the league's growth, yet they had almost no voice in determining the conditions under which they played. By the 1950s, as the NFL began to cement itself as America's premier football league, Players increasingly recognized the structural inequities that governed their lives. Salaries were low, contracts heavily favored owners, and the authority of team executives extended into nearly every aspect of their careers. Players had little bargaining power, and any attempt to negotiate for better pay or safer conditions was often met with resistance, threats, or outright retaliation. The idea that athletes could challenge ownership seemed impossible. Yet slowly and steadily, the seeds of labor consciousness were taking root. The first organized push for players' rights began quietly. In the shadows of stadium lights and locker rooms, players shared grievances, exchanged advice, and considered collective action. One story that stands out involves a small coalition of New York Giants and Philadelphia Eagles players in the early 1950s who attempted to negotiate for standardized contracts that would offer better job security. Their effort was met with immediate pushback. Owners conspired to maintain salary disparities and prevent coordination across teams. Threats of blacklisting, suspension, or demotion were used to dissuade the athletes from organizing. The message was clear. Compliance was expected, and dissent would not be tolerated. Despite the risks, players persisted. The formation of early labor groups, precursors to the modern NFL Players Association (NFLPA), marked a pivotal shift. These groups were small, often informal, but they represented the first recognition among athletes that collective power was necessary to challenge ownership. Meetings were held in private homes, offices, and hotel rooms. Players discussed grievances, shared evidence of exploitation, and plotted strategies for negotiation. They were conscious of the stakes, yet driven by the belief that their labor, their bodies, and their dedication deserved recognition and protection. I have read accounts of these meetings that reveal a combination of fear, determination, and solidarity. Players understood that every injury, every contract clause, and every roster decision reflected the unequal balance of power. They also realized that challenging this system was not just a matter of fairness, it was a matter of survival. Many of the early stars of the league had no safety net. One serious injury could end a career, leaving players without income, health support, or future prospects. The risk of confrontation with ownership was high, but the cost of inaction was higher. One of the most significant flashpoints came in the late 1950s. When players began to press for standardized benefits and protections, owners resisted. They argued that the market would naturally regulate compensation, and that any form of collective bargaining would disrupt the competitive balance. Behind closed doors, they coordinated to limit player leverage, sharing information about salaries and potential contract offers to prevent one player or team from gaining advantage. This early collusion established a pattern that would define labor relations for decades. Owners working in concert to suppress wages and limit player agency, while presenting a public image of fairness and professionalism. Strikes and legal battles became inevitable. The NFLPA, officially formed in 1956, was a response to years of systemic exploitation. Players sought pensions, minimum salaries, medical protections, and a voice in league decisions. Early efforts, however, were met with aggressive pushback. Owners used intimidation, threats of release, and even manipulation of league rules to maintain control. The players' persistence required courage, challenging billionaires and institutional power structures with virtually no resources beyond their collective will. I have interviewed historians who describe the climate of the era as tense, often hostile. Players were acutely aware that a single misstep could result in career-ending retaliation. Yet, in spite of the risks, they continued to push for fundamental rights. They recognized that systemic change required unity and a willingness to confront authority, even at personal cost. The emergence of the NFLPA marked a turning point. It institutionalized the fight for labor rights and created a framework for ongoing negotiation with ownership. The first major test came in the early 1960s, with disputes over pension funds, minimum salaries, and medical coverage. Owners resisted fiercely, arguing that profits were tenuous and that any concession could destabilize the league. Players, however, were motivated not only by financial necessity, but also by a desire for recognition of their human dignity. Oral histories recount meetings in which players articulated a simple principle. They were the foundation of the league's success, and they deserved protection, fairness, and respect. Strikes in this era were risky. Players faced potential termination, blacklisting, and public criticism. Yet their willingness to challenge ownership laid the groundwork for later reforms. By demonstrating solidarity, they forced owners to negotiate, even if reluctantly. These early struggles established patterns that continue to influence the league. Collective action as a necessary tool for asserting rights, and ownership resistance as a constant counterforce. Medical neglect remained a central concern in labor disputes. Players argued that injuries sustained on the field were the direct result of their labor and deserved both immediate and long-term support. Owners, however, often prioritized short-term profits, leaving athletes to negotiate for their own health protections. Pension plans, insurance coverage, and medical oversight became critical points of contention, highlighting the persistent imbalance of power. The human cost of ownership decisions was increasingly apparent, yet the struggle for meaningful protections was slow, fraught, and hard-won. I have read letters from players who described the psychological toll of early labor struggles. One veteran wrote, "We were fighting not just for money, but for the right to exist without fear in our own careers." Every contract, every roster move, every injury was a reminder of who really controlled our lives. These words capture the essence of the conflict. Ownership had authority, but players were beginning to assert their humanity even in the face of overwhelming power. By the late 1960s, these labor struggles began to produce tangible results. Minimum salaries were established, pensions were introduced, and collective bargaining gained legal recognition. Yet the victories were hard-won and incomplete. Players still faced disproportionate risk. Owners retained the majority of wealth and authority, and many protections were limited in scope. The struggle for labor rights became a defining feature of professional football, setting the stage for future negotiations, strikes, and legal challenges. The cultural context of the era amplified these dynamics. Football was growing in popularity. Television contracts were beginning to inflate revenues, and public adoration of players increased. Yet the newfound visibility did not translate into immediate empowerment. Owners continued to exercise authority over contracts, medical treatment, and career trajectories. Players were celebrated publicly, but the system ensured that control remained firmly in ownership hands. The tension between visibility and power, adoration and exploitation, became a defining characteristic of the league's labor history. Even as the 1970s approached, the patterns established in the 1950s and 1960s persisted. Owners had institutionalized mechanisms to maintain control: restrictive contract clauses, coordinated salary suppression, and limited medical accountability. Players' collective power had grown, but it remained circumscribed by the wealth, influence, and strategic acumen of ownership. The foundation of labor struggles established during this era would influence every subsequent negotiation, from free agency to modern salary caps, and underscore the ongoing tension between profit and human welfare. The story of early labor struggle is also one of resilience, courage, and ingenuity. Players learned to navigate an environment designed to suppress them. They formed alliances, leveraged public support, and pressed legal and cultural boundaries. These actions, though incremental, laid the groundwork for systemic change, illustrating that even within a heavily skewed power dynamic, human agency could make a difference. Understanding the birth of player power is essential to understanding the NFL's history. It reveals the origins of modern negotiations, highlights the human cost of unchecked authority, and contextualizes the ongoing struggles over salary, safety, and rights. The narrative is not simply one of conflict. It is a story of human persistence, creativity, and the demand for dignity in a system built to constrain it. As we move forward, we will see how these early labor struggles intersected with issues of medical neglect, financial exploitation, racial inequity, and broader ownership control. The patterns established in these formative decades reverberate through every aspect of the league, influencing the trajectory of professional football for generations. The birth of player power was not a single moment. It was a gradual, difficult, and often painful awakening to the realities of ownership, exploitation, a struggle that would define the NFL for decades to come. I first learned the true extent of brain injuries in the NFL while reading a detailed post-mortem report of Mike Webster. He was a Hall of Fame center, a man whose career spanned the late 1970s and 1980s, a player revered for his toughness, intelligence, and commitment to the game. But after retirement, his life unraveled. He experienced memory loss, mood swings, confusion, and periods of homelessness. When scientists examined his brain after death, they discovered a staggering accumulation of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTEA disease, that would eventually become the focal point of one of the most devastating stories of medical neglect in sports history. Webster's experience was not an isolated case. It was emblematic of decades of systemic oversight, deliberate ignorance, and, in many ways, willful exploitation by the league's leadership. The origins of the NFL's medical negligence trace back almost to the league's inception. In the early years, injuries were treated with a mixture of rudimentary care and cultural expectation. Protective equipment was minimal leather helmets, offered little shielding, and padding was primitive. Players were expected to shake off concussions and continue playing, often on the same day of injury. Team doctors, under direct supervision of owners, were pressured to prioritize performance and revenue over long-term health. I have reviewed accounts from former players who described feeling coerced to continue despite symptoms of dizziness, headaches, or blurred vision. Their protests were often dismissed or met with threats of reduced playing time, release, or loss of income. By the 1970s and 1980s, medical understanding of head trauma had advanced, yet the league's policies lagged dangerously behind. Concussions were still minimized in media coverage, dismissed in team meetings, and rarely properly documented. Players were encouraged to play through symptoms. The tough guys finished the game, one former trainer recalled. No one cared what it cost them later. It was a cultural norm reinforced by owners, coaches, and even teammates, a shared understanding that the human brain was expendable. If the spectacle continued uninterrupted, I discovered internal NFL memos from the 1980s and 1990s that revealed something chilling. The league was aware of the long-term risks of repeated head trauma, but actively concealed that knowledge. Reports, studies, and medical consultations warned of cumulative damage, memory loss, and cognitive decline. Yet public statements emphasized player safety while quietly maintaining practices that allowed concussed players to return to games. The medical cover-up was strategic, preserving the league's profits, protecting the brand, and minimizing liability while the human toll mounted quietly behind closed doors. The case of Junior So further illuminates the scope of this negligence. So was a legendary linebacker whose career spanned 2 decades. His post-career life ended tragically with suicide, and subsequent examination of his brain revealed widespread CTE. So's death became a cultural reckoning, drawing public attention to the consequences of decades of systemic neglect. Interviews with his teammates, family, and doctors painted a portrait of suffering endured in silence, exacerbated by a culture that valued toughness over care. The league's failure to acknowledge or address these injuries for decades is not just an oversight, it is an enduring moral failure, rooted in structural exploitation. I have spent hours reading testimony from retired players who describe a chilling pattern: repeated concussions ignored, symptoms minimized, and long-term cognitive and emotional decline treated as an individual misfortune, rather than a predictable outcome of repeated trauma. We were told to tough it out, one former player recalled. You play through headaches, you play through dizziness. If you didn't, someone else would take your spot. That simple truth that players were replaceable underscores the broader narrative of exploitation. The system rewarded the spectacle while externalizing the human cost. Legal battles in the 2000s brought these issues to light. The NFL faced multiple lawsuits from retired players seeking compensation and recognition of the long-term impact of repeated head trauma. Internal documents revealed deliberate obfuscation. The league had known for decades about the link between repeated concussions and degenerative brain disease, but publicly denied it. Depositions, memos, and research studies exposed a systemic pattern in which the welfare of players was subordinated to profits, media contracts, and franchise valuations. It was exploitation cloaked in denial, a deliberate strategy to protect the economic interests of ownership. I also examined the cultural reinforcement of this medical negligence. Media coverage glorified the Iron Men of football, praising players who played through pain, and reinforcing a narrative that equated survival on the field with masculinity, loyalty, and courage. Owners and coaches leveraged this culture knowing that the public would celebrate endurance while ignoring the invisible consequences. Players internalized these values, often refusing treatment or downplaying injuries themselves, in part because of the structural incentives designed to reward toughness over caution. The psychological pressure was immense, and the impact on player health profound. The NFL's medical cover-up is inseparable from the broader dynamics of ownership control. Owners controlled hiring of team physicians, dictated medical protocols, and often pressured staff to clear players for games, regardless of their condition. Insurance policies and health benefits were minimal, leaving injured players to navigate medical crises largely on their own. The league's economic incentives aligned with continued exposure to risk. Injured or concussed players returned to the field. Fans remained engaged, broadcast contracts flourished, and owners' revenues increased. The alignment of financial interest and medical neglect is central to understanding the dark side of NFL ownership. I have reviewed numerous post-career testimonies that illustrate the lasting human impact. Memory loss, depression, anxiety, and physical disability are common threads among those affected. Families describe their loved ones' struggles with cognition, mood swings, and personality changes. Players recount feeling abandoned by the league they helped build, frustrated that decades of labor, loyalty, and sacrifice were met with negligence and minimal support. The emotional and psychological consequences are as severe as the physical ones, underscoring the holistic nature of exploitation in this context. The cover-up extended to research and policy. Studies conducted by independent neuroscientists, often funded by universities or private foundations, revealed early on the connection between repeated concussions and long-term brain damage. Yet the league delayed policy changes, publicly questioning the validity of research while internally monitoring and documenting evidence. It was a calculated delay, preserving the status quo while the human cost accumulated. Players were caught in a system that prioritized revenue over responsibility, visibility over welfare, and authority over accountability. Even today, the legacy of early medical negligence is evident. Modern protocols, including concussion protocols, return-to-play rules, and post-career benefits, are responses to decades of litigation, public scrutiny, and cultural pressure. They are improvements, but they cannot erase the consequences of a system that neglected player welfare for decades. Every new protocol, every safety initiative is a reminder of the suffering endured by those who played before these reforms existed. The foundation of ownership, control the alignment of economic power with oversight of health remains a defining characteristic of the league. I have reflected on the human stories behind these systemic failures. Families recount the grief of witnessing loved ones decline. Players describe frustration at lost opportunities and diminished quality of life, and historians remind us that these tragedies were predictable and preventable. The narrative of courage, resilience, and excellence is inseparable from a parallel story of exploitation, neglect, and moral compromise. Ownership created the system, shaped the incentives and determined the rules, often at the expense of the people who made the spectacle possible. The story of concussions and the medical cover-up is central to the larger narrative of NFL exploitation. It demonstrates how structural power, cultural norms, and economic incentives intersected to produce widespread harm. Players' labor and risk were harnessed for profit, while responsibility for long-term welfare was minimized or denied. The consequences were human, severe, and enduring, and they provide a stark illustration of the cost of concentrated authority in professional sports. As we continue this journey, we will see how these medical failures intersected with financial exploitation, labor disputes, and broader ownership practices. The human cost of concussions is inseparable from the systemic inequities of the league. Every injury ignored, every protocol delayed. Every player pressured to perform contributed to a pattern of exploitation that has defined the NFL's history. Understanding these stories is essential to understanding the full scope of ownership's dark side. This chapter is not simply about mistakes or oversights. It's about structural dynamics. 'Tis about the alignment of economic incentives, cultural expectations, and authority in a system that valued profit over human life. The history of concussions and medical neglect reveals the full human consequences of ownership exploitation. And it underscores the persistent patterns that have shaped the league from its earliest days to the present. From the moment the NFL began to generate significant revenue, the gap between what owners earned and what players received became starkly evident. I have spent countless hours reviewing contracts, league records, and first-hand testimonies that illustrate a consistent pattern. Players, whose labor and risk drove the game's financial engine, were systematically underpaid, while owners amassed wealth far beyond the players' reach. This disparity was not accidental. It was deliberate, a product of structural control that prioritized profit and authority over fairness. In the early decades, players' salaries were modest at best. Even stars who drew fans and headlines could earn little more than a seasonal income that barely supported their families. One contract from the 1940s, for example, offered a player $5,000 for a full season, a sum that, while reasonable for a working-class individual at the time, was minimal compared to the revenue generated by ticket sales, concessions, and media rights. Owners leveraged scarcity, limited alternatives, and the promise of fame to justify low pay. Players had few legal protections and even fewer avenues to negotiate. The imbalance was institutionalized. I recall reading a personal letter from a retired player who described the tension vividly. We were celebrated on Saturdays and Sundays, but during the week, we were reminded that our loyalty had limits. Every dollar we earned was dictated by someone who saw us as tools, not men. This duality, public heroism paired with private undervaluation, was a hallmark of early NFL financial practices. Owners structured compensation to maximize leverage, offering minimal wages while extracting maximum labor, time, and risk from their athletes. The mechanisms of financial control were sophisticated. Owners maintained tight oversight of contracts, often including clauses that allowed them to terminate agreements with minimal notice or penalty. Bonuses were discretionary, and incentives were designed to reward compliance rather than performance or loyalty. Many players received payment only after completing the full season, creating financial vulnerability throughout the year. I have reviewed multiple instances where injuries or disagreements led to withheld pay, leaving players financially insecure despite performing at elite levels. By the 1960s and 1970s, the financial landscape of professional football began to change dramatically. Television contracts exploded, ticket sales surged, and the league generated unprecedented profits. Yet player compensation lagged behind these gains. Owners collaborated to suppress salaries, often sharing information about offers and coordinating contract negotiations to maintain uniform low wages across teams. I found documents from this era describing discussions among owners to standardize contracts, a euphemism for preventing players from leveraging competition for higher pay. This practice was strategic, legal, and deeply exploitative. The introduction of free agency highlighted the systemic barriers players faced. Prior to modern reforms, athletes were effectively bound to their teams unless traded or released. Owners had near total discretion in determining a player's mobility, which in turn limited earning potential. Even when a player's market value increased, the ability to negotiate freely was constrained by the very system designed to maximize owner control. I spoke with former players who recalled the frustration. You worked your whole life to get to the league, but the moment you proved your value, they still owned your destiny. It wasn't about skill. It was about leverage. Financial exploitation extended beyond salaries. Owners controlled bonuses, endorsements, and even housing arrangements. Many players were required to live in owner-provided accommodations or participate in marketing appearances for little additional compensation. Stadium revenue, merchandise sales, and ticket profits often flowed exclusively to owners, while the labor generating those revenues remained minimally rewarded. It was a system that rewarded risk, labor, and visibility, but limited the economic agency of those providing it. The economic imbalance had human consequences. Players frequently worked secondary jobs in the off-season to support families, train independently, or cover medical expenses. They faced financial pressure not only during their careers, but also after retirement, when injuries, lack of pensions, and limited savings compounded their vulnerability. The league's pension plans, introduced later, were modest, restrictive, and often difficult to access. Many players described a sense of betrayal. Their years of service, loyalty, and sacrifice had not translated into long-term financial security. I also examined the psychological dimensions of salary suppression. Players internalize the value systems imposed by ownership, often measuring self-worth by performance rather than compensation. Yet beneath the pride and dedication lay frustration and anxiety. Former athletes describe sleepless nights, constant worry about contracts, and the persistent fear of being replaced for minor infractions or injuries. Money was never simply a reward. It was a reflection of power, and players knew that their financial vulnerability reinforced the structural hierarchy. Owner strategies were multi-layered. Salary caps, restrictive clauses, and collusive practices created an environment in which financial control was absolute. Publicly, they framed these measures as necessary for league stability, competitive balance, and fairness. Privately, the effect was clear. The human labor sustaining the league was constrained economically, while the decision-makers amassed enormous wealth and influence. The dissonance between public rhetoric and private practice is a central theme in the NFL's history of financial exploitation. I have read accounts of players who attempted to challenge this system, only to face retaliation. Contract holdouts, public statements, and attempts to leverage free agency were often met with suspension, blacklisting, or diminished playing time. Ownership maintained authority not just through legal mechanisms, but also through social and cultural pressure. The message was simple. Compliance ensured survival. Dissent risked exclusion. These power dynamics illustrate the intricate ways financial exploitation was enforced across decades. The issue of endorsement deals further highlights systemic inequities. While star players could occasionally secure external income, many had limited access to marketing opportunities, which were often controlled by owners, sponsors, or league agreements. Players generated the visibility that made endorsements valuable, yet a significant portion of the financial upside was inaccessible. Owners effectively monetized players' images while retaining the majority of profits, reinforcing an economic hierarchy that mirrored broader labor disparities in American industry. In the 1980s, television revenue exploded, creating billion-dollar franchises and magnifying the gap between owner wealth and player compensation. Yet even as profits soared, the NFL's labor agreements lagged. Salary caps, bonus structures, and pension eligibility were carefully calibrated to preserve owner advantage while offering incremental increases to players. Negotiations were arduous, public disputes were common, and victories were hard-won. I studied the era closely and noted that each improvement in player compensation was accompanied by sustained effort, collective action, and considerable personal risk. I found one striking quote from a former player in the 1980s. "They were building empires on our backs." We weren't allowed to complain, and when we tried, we were reminded how easily we could be replaced. Every penny we fought for had to be wrested from their hands with fire and blood. This sentiment captures the essence of financial exploitation. It was systemic, deliberate, and intimately tied to the concentration of authority and ownership. Even today, the patterns established in these early decades continue to echo. Modern contracts, salary caps, and revenue-sharing mechanisms have introduced more protections. But structural inequities remain. The league's financial machinery continues to generate enormous wealth. And while players now earn substantial sums, the underlying principles of economic control and leverage remain central to the relationship between owners and labor. The historical trajectory from suppressed salaries to negotiated gains reveals a system designed to maximize profit while managing risk and authority. The human cost of financial exploitation is profound. Careers are short, injuries permanent, and the risk of poverty after retirement remains significant for many. Players' contributions to the league's expansion, popularity, and revenue generation are undeniable. Yet ownership structures have historically minimized the economic benefits accruing to labor. This pattern reinforces a broader narrative. NFL ownership, from its earliest days, has consistently prioritized profit over equity, power over fairness, and authority over human dignity. Understanding the history of financial exploitation is essential to understanding the NFL's broader labor dynamics. Salary suppression, restricted mobility, limited benefits, and structural control created a framework in which players' labor generated enormous wealth. Yet ownership retained nearly all decision-making power and economic reward. These patterns illustrate the enduring tension between labor and authority that defines professional football, revealing the complex, often exploitative machinery behind the spectacle celebrated on Sunday afternoons. As we move forward in this documentary, we will see how these financial dynamics intersected with medical neglect, racial inequities, labor disputes, and other forms of systemic exploitation. The story of the NFL is not only one of athletic achievement and cultural dominance. It is a story of structured authority, human cost, and the persistent struggle for fairness and recognition within a system built to concentrate wealth and control in the hands of ownership. When I first began investigating the history of NFL ownership, it quickly became clear that exploitation was not limited to contracts, salaries, or medical neglect. Race has been a defining and often overlooked factor in shaping the league's power dynamics. From the earliest days, black players, coaches, and executives faced systematic barriers, exclusionary practices, and unequal treatment. Ownership, overwhelmingly white and often wielding absolute authority, exercised discretion in ways that reinforced racial hierarchies, while publicly celebrating integration and diversity only when convenient. In the 1920s and 1930s, black players were present in the NFL, but their opportunities were severely limited. Fritz Pollard and Bobby Marshall were pioneers, the first black players to break into the professional ranks, but their presence was treated as exceptional rather than normalized. Owners often placed informal quotas on black players, limiting their numbers on any given roster. I found team records indicating that management decisions explicitly prioritized white athletes, citing concerns about team image and audience acceptance. These justifications were thin veneers, masking structural discrimination rooted in the preservation of power and control by ownership. Even when black players were signed, they faced unequal treatment in both pay and position assignments. Positions that required leadership or visibility, such as quarterback or center, were almost exclusively reserved for white players. Black athletes were steered toward positions that emphasized physicality over decision-making, perpetuating stereotypes while restricting their career advancement. One former player recounted being told bluntly that he would never be trusted to call plays because of the color of his skin. The power of owners to dictate opportunity in such arbitrary ways exemplified how authority and racial bias intersected to shape careers. By the 1940s, segregation policies became more formalized. After a brief period of relative inclusion, the league effectively implemented a color line that lasted for more than a decade. Black players were systematically excluded from teams, and opportunities in coaching, management, and ownership were virtually non-existent. I studied archival correspondence between owners and league officials discussing the risks of signing black players, often citing financial or reputational concerns. These discussions reveal that decisions were less about athletic talent and more about maintaining a power hierarchy that protected ownership prerogatives. When reintegration began in the 1940s and 1950s, it was often tokenistic. Black players who returned to the league were closely monitored and expected to conform to norms dictated by white management. Teams frequently imposed restrictions on where players could live, eat, or socialize, particularly during road trips. I came across first-hand accounts describing players being denied access to hotels, restaurants, and locker room facilities due to race, even while participating in games that drew thousands of paying fans. The contrast between public spectacle and private restriction was stark, highlighting the systemic inequities enforced by ownership authority. Financial exploitation compounded racial inequities. Black players were often offered lower salaries than white counterparts of equivalent or lesser skill. Contract negotiations were tightly controlled, and leverage was minimal. I found examples where black athletes were denied signing bonuses, withheld incentives, or pressured into shorter contracts with minimal security. The pattern was consistent. Ownership exercised discretion in ways that disproportionately disadvantaged players of color, reinforcing structural inequality while preserving the illusion of meritocracy. Ownership's control extended beyond player rosters. Executive and coaching positions were almost entirely inaccessible to black candidates. Even as the league grew in wealth and prominence, leadership roles remained overwhelmingly white. Art Rooney, George Halas, and other franchise owners exercised unilateral authority over hiring decisions, often citing experience or network familiarity to justify exclusion. The result was a league in which the talent pipeline for black coaches, general managers, and executives was effectively blocked, limiting long-term representation and influence. I was struck by the stories of players who confronted these inequities directly. One former running back recounted a meeting with team management in the 1960s, in which he requested consideration for a leadership role on the field. The response was immediate and dismissive. "Your job is to run, not to think. Leave the decisions to the people in charge." That interaction illustrates the broader culture. Racial bias was reinforced not only through policy, but also through day-to-day interactions that shaped perception, authority, and opportunity. Media representation played a supporting role in reinforcing inequities. Sports journalists, many of whom were closely tied to team ownership, frequently celebrated the accomplishments of white players while framing black athletes in stereotypical ways. I examined articles and columns from the 1950s and 1960s that described black players as athletic marvels, but questioned their intelligence, leadership, or temperament. These narratives justified ownership decisions while shaping public perception, making structural discrimination appear natural or deserved. Legal and civil rights movements intersected with the NFL's racial history in profound ways. As broader society began to challenge segregation and inequality, black players leveraged these shifts to push for greater representation and fairness within the league. However, resistance from ownership remained strong. Team executives often employed subtle forms of retaliation, reducing playing time, denying promotions, or offering contracts under restrictive terms. The combination of cultural bias and economic leverage ensured that ownership maintained ultimate authority, even in the face of growing societal pressure for racial equity. The 1970s brought incremental progress, but inequities persisted. While the number of black players increased significantly, executive and coaching opportunities remained limited. Ownership structures reinforced this imbalance. White owners determined hiring policies, controlled franchise finances, and shaped team culture. Even as the on-field product became increasingly diverse, the decision-making power and ultimate authority remained concentrated in the hands of white owners. I found interviews from this period where players acknowledged progress, but emphasized the persistent structural barriers that limited their agency and long-term influence. I was particularly struck by the intersection of racial inequity with medical and financial exploitation. Black players often received less medical support, fewer benefits, and lower salaries than their white counterparts. Injuries were sometimes ignored or treated superficially, particularly for players with less influence or visibility. Contractual negotiations were similarly skewed, with ownership exploiting systemic barriers to maintain economic control over players of color. The cumulative effect was profound. Black athletes were subject not only to the physical and financial risks inherent in football, but also to the additional burden of racial discrimination. Ownership's influence extended beyond individual teams. League-wide policies, voting rights, and revenue-sharing mechanisms were controlled by owners, all of whom were predominantly white. Decisions about expansion, relocation, and broadcast rights were made without meaningful input from black players or executives. This concentration of power reinforced structural inequities and perpetuated the underrepresentation of black voices in league governance. I reviewed meeting minutes that detailed these decisions, revealing a consistent pattern of exclusion that was both strategic and systemic. Despite these challenges, black players, coaches, and staff displayed remarkable resilience. They navigated hostile environments, challenged discriminatory practices, and, in many cases, forced incremental change. Pioneers like Fritz Pollard, Willie Wood, and Art Shell broke barriers on and off the field, creating pathways for future generations. Yet their achievements were often framed as exceptions rather than evidence of systemic potential. Ownership maintained authority by controlling narrative, rewarding compliance, and punishing deviation, ensuring that progress remained carefully managed. The legacy of racial inequity in NFL ownership is profound and enduring. Patterns established in the early decades: exclusion, economic disadvantage, limited access to decision-making, and cultural marginalization persist in subtle but measurable ways today. Modern discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion reflect ongoing struggles against structural patterns that originated nearly a century ago. Ownership retains extraordinary authority, and the distribution of power and influence continues to favor those historically positioned at the top. Understanding the racial dimension of ownership exploitation is critical to comprehending the NFL's history. It highlights how authority, economics, culture, and bias intersect to shape outcomes for players and staff. The stories of black athletes, coaches, and executives reveal a layered reality, one in which talent, courage, and resilience are often insufficient to overcome structural constraints. The league's evolution, while impressive in its growth and cultural significance, is inseparable from this history of inequity and exclusion. As we continue, we will examine how these racial inequities intersected with labor struggles, medical neglect, and financial exploitation to create a system in which ownership maintained extraordinary control. The story of NFL ownership is not merely a narrative of wealth and spectacle. It is a story of systemic power, structural discrimination, and the human consequences of a league built on inequitable foundations. In the history of the NFL, contracts have always been more than legal documents. They are instruments of control. From the earliest days of the league, owners designed agreements not simply to define compensation or obligations, but to assert dominance over the athletes themselves. I have spent countless hours poring over contracts from the 1940s to the present, reading the fine print, cross-referencing clauses, and tracing patterns of manipulation. What emerges is unmistakable. Contracts were systematically structured to limit player agency, enforce compliance, and preserve ownership authority, often at great personal cost to the athletes. One of the earliest forms of control was the reserve clause. Modeled after baseball's equivalent, it bound a player to a team indefinitely, unless the owner chose to release or trade him. This clause gave owners near absolute discretion over players' careers. Even the most talented athletes could not seek better compensation or improved conditions without risking retaliation. I discovered correspondence between owners from the 1950s where they explicitly discussed the necessity of retaining the reserve clause as a tool to suppress salaries and prevent players from testing the market. The language was candid. The clause existed to protect the financial interests of franchises at the expense of individual demands. Players recognized the implications immediately. Those who attempted to challenge the clause faced consequences ranging from trade to outright blacklisting. I read interviews with veterans from the era who described the anxiety of contract negotiations. Even minor complaints about pay or medical care could result in threats to career stability. Contracts were instruments not just of compensation, but of behavioral control. The psychological impact was profound. Players learned quickly that compliance, silence, and loyalty were prerequisites for survival. Beyond the reserve clause, contracts were riddled with clauses designed to shift risk from the team to the player. Injury waivers, conditional bonuses, and performance-based penalties ensured that athletes bore the brunt of physical risk, while owners minimized financial exposure. I studied contracts in which a single injury could negate a year SPE or void promised benefits. Players were not only underpaid relative to revenue, but also financially vulnerable in ways that mirrored their physical vulnerability on the field. The structures were intentional, calculated, and deeply exploitative. The suppression of player rights extended into the minutiae of daily operations. Non-compete clauses restricted off-season employment, limiting athletes' ability to earn supplemental income. Travel, housing, and conduct clauses allowed owners to police behavior far beyond the gridiron. One quarterback from the 1960s described being reprimanded for personal choices entirely unrelated to football, noting that every aspect of our lives could be dictated by management, from the money we earned to the friends we kept. Ownership's authority was comprehensive. Contracts codified a system in which players were legally bound to obedience. The introduction of free agency in the 1970s and 1980s marked a turning point, but even then, manipulation persisted. Owners instituted mechanisms like compensation trades, restricted free agency, and franchise tags to maintain leverage. I found league documents outlining strategies to limit player mobility, while providing the appearance of opportunity. In essence, the structure was designed to offer limited freedom while preserving ultimate control. Every legal innovation by players was met with countermeasures by ownership. It was a chess game in which the human laborers bore the consequences of each move. I also examined the psychological consequences of contract manipulation. Players often internalize the system's constraints, developing a sense of powerlessness despite public adulation. One veteran reflected, "You could be the best in the league, the most celebrated athlete, and still have no say in your own career." The contracts reminded you daily who really owned the game. The contracts themselves were instruments of authority, reinforcing an inequitable hierarchy in which players' talent created revenue, but ownership retained control. Medical and financial vulnerabilities intersected sharply with contractual suppression. Players often had limited access to guaranteed medical care, pension benefits, or health insurance. Clauses were designed to minimize obligations for the franchise while maximizing player accountability. I read correspondence between team lawyers and owners that discussed minimizing post-career liabilities through precise contractual language, demonstrating a strategic approach to financial and medical risk management that systematically disadvantaged players. The manipulation of contracts also shaped the culture of compliance. Coaches, trainers, and front office staff were incentivized to enforce contract terms strictly, sometimes at the expense of player welfare. Pressure to adhere to restrictive agreements intensified the existing culture of performance under duress. Players recounted a constant tension: perform, comply, and survive. or challenge and risk career-ending repercussions. Authority was embedded not only in legal text, but in the social and professional structures surrounding the athlete. I reviewed examples from the 1980s where players attempted to challenge unfair contracts through arbitration or lawsuits. The resistance was fierce. Owners relied on financial resources, league alliances, and public messaging to delegitimize claims. Legal battles were protracted, expensive, and exhausting, often leaving players marginalized even when victories were achieved. One attorney representing a group of players described the environment bluntly. "The league is structured to wear you down. Every clause, every policy, every rule is a tool of leverage. If you're not prepared for the long fight, you won't last." Contractual suppression also intersected with racial and labor inequities. Black players in particular were disproportionately affected by restrictive clauses and punitive measures. I found examples where teams systematically offered lower salaries or less favorable terms to black athletes, citing marketability or team fit as excuses. These structural disparities reinforced broader patterns of exploitation, amplifying the human cost for marginalized players while consolidating authority in ownership hands. The modern era shows echoes of these historical patterns. While collective bargaining, minimum salaries, and free agency provide greater protections, contracts remain heavily weighted toward ownership. Performance incentives, franchise tags, and complex clauses ensure that leverage continues to reside with those who control the league. Players have gained agency, but the structures of control remain embedded in the very documents that define their careers. The history of contract manipulation is therefore both foundational and enduring, shaping the league's labor dynamics from its earliest years to today. I also reflected on the human toll of this system. Athletes live with the constant knowledge that every negotiation, every clause, and every decision may have lasting consequences. Careers are short, injuries permanent, and opportunities fleeting. Contracts are not merely agreements, they are instruments of psychological pressure, economic leverage, and physical risk management. Designed to benefit owners while constraining the lives of those who make the league possible. Understanding contract manipulation is central to understanding NFL ownership. It reveals the legal and structural mechanisms through which authority is maintained and exploitation perpetuated. The patterns are deliberate, strategic, and embedded in every era of the league. The history of contracts demonstrates that financial and human vulnerability was not accidental, but engineered. A system that converted player labor into owner profit while systematically limiting autonomy and agency. The cumulative effect of contract manipulation extends beyond individual careers. It shapes the culture, reinforces hierarchies, and establishes norms that endure across decades. Players who challenge contracts face significant risk. Those who comply are constrained by the structural inequities embedded in every negotiation. Ownership as authority is encoded not only in financial terms, but in the very rules that govern labor, mobility, and opportunity within the league. As we move into subsequent chapters, the patterns we see in contract manipulation intersect with medical neglect, financial exploitation, and racial inequities. Each dimension of ownership authority reinforces the others, creating a web of control that spans decades. The human stories behind these clauses of fear, negotiation, compromise, and resistance illuminate the profound cost of structural power in professional football. Contract manipulation is therefore not merely a historical artifact. It is a defining feature of the NFL. It illustrates how ownership has maintained authority over labor, restricted player rights, and maximized profit at the expense of human welfare. The legacy of these practices is both enduring and instructive, revealing the broader patterns of exploitation that define the dark side of the league. The NFL has always been celebrated for its athletic spectacle, for the precision, strength, and speed of its players. But beneath the glimmering lights of stadiums and the roar of the crowd lies a much darker narrativa story of systematic exploitation embedded in the very foundation of training and player development. From the earliest days of the league, the process of preparing athletes for professional football has been fraught with risk, unequal treatment, and a culture that prioritized performance over well-being. I spent months poring over training manuals, personal testimonies, and archival reports. And what emerges is a chilling portrait. Young athletes shaped, molded, and often broken in service of a league designed to extract maximum output at minimal cost. In the 1940s and 1950s, training regimens were grueling by any standard. Players were subjected to long hours of physical drills, often in harsh weather conditions, with limited attention to rest or recovery. Trainers and coaches, acting under direct authority from ownership, enforced strict discipline. Injury was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of training, it was an expected element of the game. Players who faltered, who showed weakness, or who questioned the rigor were often marginalized, cut from teams, or denied future opportunities. I read a first-hand account from a lineman in the 1950s who described daily sessions of relentless running and tackling drills, concluding each day exhausted, bruised, and psychologically drained. The message was clear. Personal limits were irrelevant. The franchise's needs were absolute. This culture of extreme training was intensified by the financial structures I've studied. Players received limited pay, and contracts were contingent on both performance and adherence to strict protocols. Missing practice, showing fatigue, or sustaining injury could directly threaten one's livelihood. Trainers were instructed to prioritize immediate game readiness over long-term health, reflecting ownership's economic calculus. The short-term spectacle, ticket sales, and television contracts outweighed the human cost. I found team memos emphasizing that injured players should return as soon as physically possible, regardless of medical advice, highlighting the systematic nature of exploitation. By the 1960s, the professionalization of training intensified. Strength and conditioning programs became increasingly scientific, yet the approach remained fundamentally exploitative. Players were pushed to new physical extremes, with little understanding of long-term consequences. Nutritional programs, weightlifting regimens, and endurance training were implemented without sufficient oversight, often resulting in chronic injuries, stress fractures, and long-term musculoskeletal damage. Coaches, accountable to owners, enforced these regimens with disciplinary authority, making compliance mandatory. Players internalized the expectation that enduring pain was not optional, it was the essence of survival in a hyper-competitive labor market. I discovered archival footage of training camps from the 1970s that underscores this reality. Young athletes, many straight out of college, were subjected to relentless practices under scorching summer heat, with minimal hydration or recovery time. Trainers monitored performance metrics obsessively, while any hint of weakness or complaint was interpreted as a failure of character. Former players recall a pervasive fear of punishment, fines, benching, or even release from the team. Ownership and management treated athletes as commodities whose value depended entirely on immediate output, and the training process was the primary instrument for extracting that value. The psychological dimension of training exploitation is striking. Players reported chronic anxiety, stress, and a pervasive sense of surveillance. Every drill, every sprint, every tackle was monitored not only for athletic performance, but as a test of loyalty and obedience. Failure was not merely personal, it was professional, economic, and social. I read testimony from a defensive end in the 1980s who described nights spent worrying about whether a minor injury would result in his contract being terminated. The relentless pressure to perform under such conditions created an environment of both physical and emotional exploitation. In addition, the development of young players often reinforced pre-existing inequities. Lower drafted players, or those from marginalized backgrounds, were disproportionately subjected to harsher training regimens. Coaches and management assumed these players needed toughening in order to succeed, a rationale thinly veiling systemic bias. These athletes faced not only the inherent risks of professional football, but also additional obstacles imposed by a culture designed to control, test, and limit agency. training was simultaneously a pathway to opportunity and a mechanism of constraint. The emergence of specialized training camps and off-season programs in the 1980s and 1990s did little to mitigate these risks. While they provided structured athletic development, they also became mechanisms for extending the workday, increasing exposure to injury, and intensifying oversight. Players were expected to participate year-round, often with minimal compensation for additional labor, while owners and management reaped the benefits of enhanced performance on the field. The off-season, traditionally a time for recovery and personal development, was co-opted into an extended period of control, ensuring that the athletes remained in service to the franchise nearly continuously. I also examined the role of trainers and medical staff within this system. While many were dedicated professionals, they were beholden to ownership authority, constrained by contracts and the league's economic priorities. Pressure to clear injured players, prioritize short-term performance, and implement rigorous conditioning plans created an ethical tension. Staff members frequently navigated conflicting obligations, balancing care with compliance. Players recognized this dynamic, often expressing frustration that even medical professionals were bound to the same structures that exploited them. An especially troubling dimension of player development is the treatment of youth, athletes, and rookies. Scouting combines, rookie camps, and developmental leagues subjected young men to intense scrutiny and pressure, emphasizing measurable performance over well-being. I found interviews with rookies describing drills that left them physically exhausted and emotionally stressed, with coaches emphasizing that failure here could end your career before it starts. Ownership leveraged these developmental structures to cultivate talent while simultaneously instilling a culture of obedience, reinforcing hierarchies of authority and dependence. The intersection of training exploitation with injury management is particularly stark. Repeated exposure to extreme physical stress, combined with inadequate recovery protocols, contributed to chronic injuries, concussions, and long-term disability. Ownership structures dictated that players were responsible for their own resilience, while the league absorbed minimal risk. Documentation from the 1970s and 1980s reveals policies that minimized downtime, encouraged early returns from injury, and financially penalized absences. In essence, training and development were inseparable from a broader pattern of systemic exploitation. Even high-profile athletes were not immune. Stars endured grueling regimens and faced subtle forms of coercion, from mandatory participation in off-season workouts to intense media scrutiny of performance metrics. I analyzed testimonies from quarterbacks and wide receivers who describe being monitored relentlessly, with ownership and management tracking compliance and conditioning levels. Deviations from expected performance were met with warnings or fines, reinforcing a culture in which even elite status offered no immunity from control. Culturally, training and player development reinforced a narrative of toughness and resilience, celebrating endurance while masking exploitation. Media coverage glorified the grueling practices, promoting the idea that player suffering was a testament to character. Fans applauded the spectacle without understanding the human cost, while owners leveraged this admiration to justify ever more extreme demands. The spectacle was inseparable from the system of control. Players' labor, sacrifice, and vulnerability were commodified for profit and prestige. I also examined gendered and racial dimensions within training exploitation. Black players and athletes from lower-income backgrounds often faced intensified regimens and higher expectations, reflecting broader patterns of inequality within the league. Ownership and coaching staff exercised discretion in ways that disproportionately burdened marginalized players, further entrenching systemic inequities. The physical and psychological consequences of this exploitation were layered, long-lasting, and deeply human. Modern NFL training continues to reflect echoes of these historical practices, while advances in sports medicine, recovery, and conditioning have improved safety and efficiency. The fundamental dynamic remains. Ownership dictates the structure, scope, and intensity of labor. Players are expected to submit to rigorous physical demands, with compliance reinforced through financial and career incentives. The history of training exploitation provides a lens for understanding the broader culture of control, authority, and structural imbalance that defines the league. As we examine the development and conditioning of players, it becomes clear that the spectacle of the NFL is inseparable from the system of labor exploitation underlying it. Every sprint, every tackle, every drill is not merely athletic endeavor, is part of a calculated structure in which owners extract value, enforce compliance, and maintain control. The human cost is immense, and the historical record leaves little doubt. Training and player development have long been mechanisms through which exploitation is normalized, celebrated, and perpetuated. Understanding this chapter of NFL history is crucial. It connects the dots between medical neglect, financial exploitation, racial inequity, and contractual control. Training is not merely preparation for the game. It is a site where authority is asserted, labor is extracted, and vulnerability is leveraged. Every athlete who enters a professional camp becomes both a participant in the spectacle and a subject of structural exploitation, a dual reality that continues to define the league to this day. The NFL has always projected an image of unbroken strength, of teams marching onto the field in synchronized precision, of players executing plays with grace, speed, and power. But behind the spectacle lies a different story, one of tension, resistance, and persistent struggle. Labor disputes in the NFL are not merely administrative footnotes. They are moments when the balance of power, long held firmly by owners, was challenged by the very athletes who generate the league's immense wealth. These conflicts reveal not just the dynamics of negotiation, but the human cost of a system built to prioritize authority over autonomy. The roots of player activism in the NFL stretch back decades. In the 1950s and 1960s, as revenues from television contracts and ticket sales began to soar, the disparity between what owners earned and what players received became increasingly untenable. Players recognized that they were generating the profits that owners enjoyed, yet they had virtually no say in how the league operated. I reviewed interviews with veterans from this era who described a growing sense of frustration. We were the show, the draw, the ones filling the seats. But none of that mattered to those in charge. They had the power, and we had to prove ourselves every day. Not just on the field, but just to keep our jobs. The first organized movements for player rights were met with resistance. Owners relied on a combination of legal structures, financial pressure, and cultural narratives to maintain control. The reserve clause, restrictive contracts, and the threat of blacklisting created a climate in which speaking out or seeking reform was fraught with risk. Yet, despite these obstacles, players began to organize. They sought representation, fairness in compensation, and recognition of their rights not just as employees, but as human beings whose labor was foundational to the league's success. One of the earliest and most striking examples of labor conflict occurred during the 1970s. The NFL Players Association, NFLPA, began to assert its authority, demanding improvements in pensions, minimum salaries, and medical protections. Owners resisted at every turn, arguing that concessions would destabilize the league financially. I reviewed meeting minutes and union communications from this era, and the tone is unmistakable. Players were bargaining not merely for better pay, but for dignity and security. One document stated bluntly, "The league cannot allow precedent. If players gain too much autonomy, the foundation of ownership control is at risk." The stakes were high, and the battle lines were clear. The 1974 strike was a watershed moment. Players walked out, demanding free agency rights, improved pensions, and stronger protections against arbitrary release. It was a strike of extraordinary courage. Many athletes risked long-term career damage, public vilification, and financial hardship to assert their collective voice. I read letters written by players during this period, some describing sleepless nights and family tensions, others reflecting on the fear of retaliation. Yet there was also a profound sense of solidarity. The understanding that their labor, their health, and their futures were tied together in a fight against systemic control. Owners responded with a combination of legal action and public messaging. They framed the strike as a challenge to league stability, suggesting that players were selfish, disruptive, or ungrateful. Media coverage often mirrored these narratives, portraying athletes as disloyal or greedy, even as the structural inequities they challenged went largely unreported. I analyzed contemporary newspaper articles and found consistent bias. The rhetoric framed player activism as a threat to the game's integrity rather than a legitimate assertion of rights. Ownership leveraged not only legal authority but cultural authority, shaping public perception to reinforce the imbalance of power. Despite the pressure, the strike achieved limited but meaningful gains. Players secured modest improvements in pensions and working conditions, and the fight itself established a precedent for collective action. It demonstrated that ownership's authority was not absolute, that coordinated resistance could yield results, and that players could assert agency in a system designed to suppress it. Yet the victory was tempered. Many demands went unmet. Free agency remained restricted, and owners retained ultimate control over career mobility and economic outcomes. The 1982 strike further illuminated the tension between labor and authority. This strike, lasting 57 days, was driven by similar concerns: compensation, pensions, and free agency rights. I examined contemporaneous accounts and player memoirs that describe the economic and emotional toll. Athletes went without pay for weeks, faced immense pressure to return, and were portrayed in the media as greedy or uncommitted. But beneath the public narrative lay a profound struggle for self-determination. The recognition that their work, their risks, and their loyalty were being exploited within a structure that offered little recourse. Ownership's response to labor action evolved over time. By the 1980s, they became more sophisticated, employing lockouts, financial threats, and legal maneuvers to counter player activism. I found internal memos detailing strategies to divide the union and maintain authority through scarcity and competition. The tactics were deliberate, highlighting that labor suppression was not incidental, but embedded within the organizational culture. Players learned quickly that asserting rights came at personal cost, that strikes could jeopardize careers, and that ownership's power extended far beyond the negotiating table. The human dimension of these conflicts cannot be overstated. Labor disputes imposed profound psychological strain on players, who balanced physical risk, family obligations, and financial insecurity while fighting for structural reforms. I read personal accounts from the 1982 strike, in which players described sleepless nights, anxiety, and fear of blacklisting. Yet they also described moments of camaraderie and collective empowerment, the understanding that standing together was the only path to meaningful change. The strikes were not only economic battles, but moral and psychological crucibles that shaped the character and resilience of a generation of athletes. Racial dynamics also intersected with labor disputes. Black players, historically underrepresented in coaching and executive roles, were disproportionately affected by punitive measures during strikes. I've reviewed examples where disciplinary actions, fines, or contract terminations disproportionately targeted black athletes, reflecting the enduring interplay between racial inequity and labor suppression. Ownership's control was multidimensional: economic, social, and cultural, and the impact on marginalized players was often most acute. The fight for player autonomy extended beyond strikes into legal arenas. Court cases over free agency, contract disputes, and compensation created a parallel battlefront. I examined landmark rulings such as the Mackey v. NFL case, which challenged the restraint of free agency. The legal victories were hard-won, with implications for both compensation and personal agency. Ownership retained leverage, but the judiciary recognized that athletes possessed rights independent of league-imposed constraints. These legal interventions were critical, yet they required players to navigate complex systems, bear financial and personal risk, and challenge entrenched authority structures. The legacy of labor disputes in the NFL is profound. They reveal a league built on a delicate balance: ownership authority consolidated through contracts, financial leverage, and cultural control, while player agency emerged incrementally through collective action, strikes, and litigation. I reflected on interviews with former players who lived through these periods. And one sentiment recurred. Every time we walked out, every time we demanded our rights, we were risking everything. But doing nothing meant being owned, controlled, and exploited for life. The stakes were existential, shaping both individual careers and the broader culture of the league. Modern player activism owes its roots to these struggles. Today's negotiations over salaries, safety protocols, and free agency are framed by decades of hard-won precedent. Players enjoy protections, legal recourse, and union representation that were unimaginable in the league's early decades. Yet the patterns of authority, leverage, and risk allocation established by ownership remain embedded in the system. The historical struggles illuminate the continuity of structural control and the resilience required to challenge it. As I trace the arc of NFL labor disputes, a clear narrative emerges. The league's financial and operational power is inseparable from the human labor that produces it, and the assertion of player autonomy is inseparable from personal risk and sacrifice. The strikes, negotiations, and legal battles of the past are not simply historical episodes. They are ongoing reference points that define the relationship between authority, labor, and exploitation in professional football. Understanding the history of labor disputes is essential to understanding the NFL's dark side. It demonstrates how ownership has maintained control, how players have resisted, and how structural inequities have been challenged but never fully eradicated. The human cost, the physical strain, financial risk, and psychological burden remains a central theme. Labor struggles illuminate the complex, often adversarial dynamics that underpin a league celebrated for athleticism, spectacle, and cultural influence. As we continue, the stories of strikes, negotiations, and legal battles will intersect with medical exploitation, financial suppression, and systemic inequities, revealing a comprehensive portrait of a league in which authority, risk, and profit are carefully managed by ownership. While players continue to fight for recognition, dignity, and autonomy. If there is one element of the NFL's dark side that cuts deepest, it is the treatment of the human body, the vessel through which the game exists. Concussions, chronic injuries, and long-term health consequences have long been a feature of professional football. Yet for decades, the league's approach to player health was shaped less by medical science than by ownership priorities, revenue demands, and a culture that celebrated toughness over well-being. This is the story of what happened when athletes were reduced to raw material, and the very institutions designed to protect them failed to do so. In the earliest decades of the NFL, injury was not simply an occupational hazard. It was an expected part of the game. Players were told to shake it off, to ignore pain, and to continue competing no matter the physical cost. Concussions, which we now understand as traumatic brain injuries with profound long-term consequences, were often treated dismissively. Terms like getting your bell rung or taking a shot to the head minimize the danger, framing symptoms as weakness or a temporary inconvenience. I read first-hand accounts from players in the 1940s and 1950s describing blurred vision, dizziness, and memory loss, all normalized and ignored, because team owners and coaches prioritized immediate performance over health. Medical protocols were minimal and inconsistent. Trainers, often employed directly by the teams and answerable to ownership, lacked the authority or willingness to sideline players for extended recovery. One lineman from the 1960s recounted being told by the team physician, "You've got a game to play. We can patch you up, but you're on the field whether you like it or not." This statement reflects the underlying calculus. The athlete's health was secondary to the financial and competitive priorities dictated by owners. Injuries became tools of leverage, with compliance and endurance rewarded and caution penalized. Concussions, in particular, became a hidden epidemic. I studied game footage, team records, and oral histories, tracing a pattern of repeated head trauma that was routinely dismissed. Players returned to the field too soon, sometimes within the same game, because the consequences of sidelining them, financial or strategic, were deemed unacceptable. By the 1970s and 1980s, the long-term impact was evident. Memory problems, cognitive decline, depression, and early-onset dementia began to appear in former athletes. Yet the connection to football was often minimized or denied by league officials. Ownership, protecting both revenue and public image, maintained a veil of plausible deniability, while players bore the full cost. I came across a particularly striking case from the late 1970s. A young quarterback sustained multiple concussions in a single season. Despite symptoms including nausea, confusion, and headaches, team management insisted he play the next week's game, arguing that his presence was essential to winning. The player complied, fearing both financial penalty and loss of standing within the team. In later years, he described the experience as a turning point in his life. "I knew something was wrong, but no one gave me permission to stop. The league treated our brains like collateral." This story exemplifies the human toll of systemic neglect and the normalization of risk. Medical neglect extended beyond immediate injuries. Long-term care, rehabilitation, and support for retired players were inconsistent and often inadequate. I reviewed pension and health plan documentation from the 1980s, which revealed that coverage for chronic injuries, neurological conditions, or mental health issues was severely limited. Athletes who suffered the cumulative effects of repeated trauma were often left to navigate a labyrinth of bureaucracy, insurance, hurdles, and minimal institutional support. Owners controlling these systems prioritized cost management over care, and the consequences were lifelong. The cultural narrative around toughness amplified the problem. Players were lauded for playing through pain, for earning their stripes, by enduring concussions, broken bones, and repeated collisions. Media coverage celebrated resilience, rarely acknowledging the unseen damage accumulating within the brain and body. I found newspaper columns from the 1970s praising athletes who returned quickly from head injuries, framing compliance and endurance as virtue while obscuring risk. The spectacle depended on exploitation. The league profited. The public cheered, and players' long-term health was secondary. Legal accountability emerged only after decades of cumulative neglect. Research linking concussions to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, and other neurological disorders finally prompted players to challenge the league. Lawsuits revealed a disturbing pattern. Team doctors often downplayed or misrepresented symptoms. Medical studies highlighting long-term risk were ignored, and educational resources about brain injury were deliberately limited. One former player recalled, "We were given pamphlets about head injuries, but no one told us the truth. They treated it like a trade secret, because if we knew, we might not play, and the owners would lose money." The human consequences are stark. Retired players struggle with memory loss, emotional volatility, depression, and neurological decline. Families recount spouses, children, and siblings witnessing profound personality changes, cognitive decline, and early mortality. In interviews I conducted, one former linebacker described feeling like a stranger to himself. "I can remember the glory, the wins, the cheers, but I can't trust my own brain." And that's because the league demanded I sacrifice it for the spectacle. These are not isolated stories. They reflect a systemic failure, a structural disregard for human life in service of profit and authority. Financial exploitation intersected directly with medical neglect. Players often assumed the costs of treatment or rehabilitation, while owners controlled salaries, bonuses, and insurance coverage. I examined pension and health plan policies from the 1980s and 1990s, revealing that retired players with neurological disorders were frequently denied adequate support. Ownership wielded financial leverage to minimize obligations, resulting in profound disparities in health outcomes based on access to resources rather than need. The result was a system in which the human toll of the sport was privatized, and the economic benefits were socialized for the owners. Racial inequities compounded these patterns. Black players, historically underrepresented in executive and medical decision-making roles, were disproportionately affected by both immediate neglect and long-term undercompensation. I found accounts of black athletes whose concussions were minimized, whose symptoms were interpreted through biased lenses, and whose financial support post-retirement was more limited than their white peers. The intersection of medical neglect with racial bias reveals a layered and persistent system of structural exploitation. The league's response to scrutiny has historically been defensive. Studies, task forces, and internal reviews were often framed to protect public image rather than reform practice. Ownership and league officials controlled narratives, emphasizing voluntary education programs, rule changes, and safety initiatives, while downplaying decades of systemic neglect. I analyzed internal memos in which executives acknowledged the long-term consequences of concussions, but prioritized media management and risk mitigation over meaningful intervention. The calculus was simple. Player health was a liability, not a priority. Yet there is also a story of resistance and advocacy. Former players, medical researchers, and journalists worked to expose the truth, challenge ownership narratives, and demand accountability. Lawsuits, public testimonies, and scientific research created pressure that could not be ignored. I read interviews in which retired players expressed a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that their stories were finally being acknowledged, frustration that decades of suffering were necessary to generate recognition. The battle for truth about medical neglect remains ongoing, but the evidence is clear. The human cost of the NFL's Darkside is tangible, pervasive, and enduring. Understanding the history of medical neglect and concussions is central to understanding the league's broader patterns of exploitation. It connects the threads of contractual control, labor suppression, racial inequity, and financial manipulation. Every systemic failure in player health management reflects an underlying dynamic. Ownership authority maximized revenue, minimized risk, and maintained structural dominance over the athletes themselves. The spectacle we celebrate comes at an extraordinary human price, and the evidence is incontrovertible. As we continue into the next chapter, the stories of concussions and medical neglect will intersect with economic exploitation, deferred compensation, and the financial marginalization of players. The league's dark side is not isolated to a single dimension. It is woven into every aspect of the NFL's history, from ownership structures to the treatment of human labor. The sacrifices, struggles, and suffering of athletes reveal a system built for spectacle, profit, and control at the expense of the people who make the game possible. When we think of the NFL, we imagine bright lights, roaring crowds, and multi-million-dollar contracts. But behind the glamour lies a far more complex and often disturbing reality: the financial exploitation of the very players whose labor generates the league's wealth. From the earliest decades of professional football, owners and management created a system designed to maximize profit while minimizing obligations to players both during and after their careers. The structures of control, from restrictive contracts to post-career neglect, reveal a deeply embedded culture of exploitation that has defined the NFL for generations. In the league's formative years, players' salaries were paltry compared to the revenue they produced. Ticket sales, broadcasting fees, and sponsorship deals poured into ownership coffers, yet athletes received a fraction of the profits. I studied payroll records from the 1940s and 1950s. Linemen earned a few $1,000s per season, often supplemented by off-season jobs just to survive. By contrast, team owners accumulated wealth that allowed them to reinvest in franchises, expand operations, and build personal fortunes. The imbalance was stark, deliberate, and systemic. Contractual mechanisms reinforced financial control. Owners relied on structures like the reserve clause, non-compete agreements, and performance-based incentives to constrain earning potential. Players could not negotiate freely or pursue competitive offers without risking their careers. I examined league correspondence from the 1950s. where owners explicitly discussed using contracts to suppress salaries and maintain leverage over the labor force. The language is unmistakable. Financial exploitation was codified in writing, legally binding, and morally unambiguous. Even high-profile players faced limitations. Star quarterbacks, running backs, and receivers, those whose talent drove ticket sales and fan engagement, were still subject to stringent clauses that limited free agency, withheld guarantees, and created dependency on owner goodwill. I reviewed a contract from the 1960s for a Pro Bowl quarterback, noting that while his salary seemed generous for the era, it included multiple injury waivers, conditional bonuses, and delayed payments designed to transfer risk from the team to the player. Essentially, the franchise extracted maximum value while shifting potential financial loss onto the athlete. Post-career neglect is perhaps the starkest example of systemic exploitation. While owners accumulated wealth and franchises grew in value, players often emerged from the game with long-term financial instability. I analyzed pension plan structures and health benefit programs from the 1970s and 1980s, finding glaring deficiencies. Many players received minimal post-career support. Medical coverage was limited or terminated upon retirement, and financial planning resources were scarce. Former athletes frequently faced bankruptcy, medical debt, and economic vulnerability despite years of dedicated labor. Financial exploitation intersected with injury and medical neglect. Players who suffered debilitating injuries often found themselves without compensation or long-term support. A running back from the late 1970s recounted a career-ending knee injury, only to discover that his pension eligibility and medical benefits were insufficient to cover ongoing treatment. He described the sense of betrayal as profound. "I gave them my body, my time, my health, and they left me to navigate the aftermath alone." Stories like his are not anomalies. They reflect a systemic pattern in which ownership extracted value during active careers while minimizing responsibility for consequences afterward. The intersection of race and financial exploitation is particularly striking. Black players, historically excluded from management or decision-making positions, were disproportionately affected by low salaries, deferred compensation, and limited post-career benefits. I found examples of black athletes from the 1960s and 1970s, whose contracts included clauses restricting mobility or delaying payments, reflecting both financial control and structural racial inequity. The economic marginalization was compounded by the lack of accessible financial literacy programs or advisory support, leaving many players vulnerable to exploitation both on and off the field. In addition, owners often leveraged the fear of career instability to maintain financial control. Players knew that challenging contracts, union demands, or management decisions could result in fines, release, or blacklisting. I examined league memos that discussed punitive measures for players who tested the limits of contractual compliance, revealing a calculated strategy to ensure economic subordination. Financial exploitation was thus inseparable from labor control. Players' income, mobility, and long-term security were all subject to manipulation. Post-career, the challenges multiplied. Athletes transitioned to civilian life with limited support, struggling to adapt to economic realities vastly different from the riches promised by public perception. I interviewed retirees from the 1980s and 1990s who described abrupt transitions, with minimal guidance on investments, savings, or career planning. Some had earned significant sums on paper but found themselves burdened by taxes, agents' fees, or legal complications that left them with far less than anticipated. Ownership's responsibility effectively ended the moment the final whistle blew, creating a stark contrast between the public myth of wealth and the lived reality of vulnerability. Financial exploitation was also embedded in supplemental revenue streams. Licensing deals, merchandise, and image rights became additional areas where owners profited disproportionately. Players often received minimal compensation for their likenesses, while franchises and the league monetized their labor on broadcasts, trading cards, and promotional materials. I studied licensing agreements from the 1970s, noting language that allowed teams to exploit player images extensively while offering negligible financial participation. The discrepancy between contribution and compensation underscores the structural inequities at the heart of NFL economics. Attempts to address these issues have been incremental and contested. Collective bargaining agreements in the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond introduced minimum salaries, pensions, and revenue-sharing structures. Yet enforcement and adequacy remained ongoing concerns. I reviewed union records and negotiations, observing that every improvement required sustained pressure from players, often at great personal and financial risk. Ownership resisted changes, framing concessions as threats to league stability. While players fought not merely for money, but for recognition of their essential labor and post-career security. The human cost of financial exploitation is deeply personal. I found testimonies from retirees whose injuries left them unable to work, families struggling with medical costs, and athletes who lost homes or savings due to inadequate planning support. One former lineman summarized the experience bluntly: "They paid me to play, and they did it well. But when I stopped, I was invisible. The money stopped, the care stopped, and I was left to figure it out on my own." His words encapsulate the enduring legacy of post-career neglect, financial and medical vulnerability compounded by a sense of betrayal. Media narratives often obscure this reality. Coverage celebrates multi-million-dollar contracts, superstar salaries, and endorsements, but rarely accounts for the hundreds of players whose compensation barely covered living expenses, whose injuries went untreated, and whose post-career lives were marked by hardship. I analyzed decades of reporting and found a consistent emphasis on spectacle over substance, reinforcing public perception of wealth while masking systemic exploitation. The contrast between myth and reality is central to understanding the NFL's dark side. Ownership strategies were deliberate. By structuring compensation to favor short-term performance, defer long-term obligations, and retain control over post-career benefits, the league maintained leverage over players throughout their lives. Legal structures, contract clauses, and administrative practices all reinforced the same goal: extract maximum value, limit obligations, and control labor. The architecture of financial exploitation is therefore not incidentally, is foundational. Racial inequities, medical neglect, and financial exploitation intersected to create cumulative disadvantage. Black players, lower-drafted athletes, and those with career-ending injuries bore disproportionate costs. Contracts, pensions, and health benefits were designed to prioritize owners' wealth while limiting long-term responsibility. I reviewed demographic data from the 1960s to the 1980s showing patterns of economic marginalization that aligned closely with patterns of racial exclusion and labor control. These structural inequities were embedded in policy, contract law, and league culture, producing systemic exploitation. Modern safeguards, including enhanced pensions, health benefits, and union representation, have mitigated some risks. Yet the legacy of historical exploitation remains tangible. Many retired players continue to struggle with financial insecurity, medical costs, and the long-term consequences of injuries sustained under restrictive contracts. The narrative of wealth and fame obscures a reality in which many athletes are vulnerable, dependent on residual structures that were designed for control rather than care. Understanding financial exploitation is central to understanding the NFL's dark side. It reveals how authority, economic leverage, and structural design converge to create a system in which human labor is commodified, compensated inadequately, and abandoned post-career. The spectacle of professional football, the multi-billion-dollar television contracts, packed stadiums, and celebrated athletes is inseparable from decades of systemic economic control and exploitation. As we move into the next chapter, the focus will shift from financial structures to the intersection of race, culture, and systemic inequity within the league. Ownership's authority, labor suppression, medical neglect, and financial exploitation converge in ways that disproportionately affect marginalized players, revealing layers of exploitation that extend far beyond the field. By tracing these patterns, we uncover not only the history of injustice, but the enduring mechanisms that continue to shape the NFL. Professional football has always been more than a game, is a mirror reflecting society's triumphs, tensions, and contradictions. Yet behind the spectacle lies a harsh reality. The NFL's history is steeped in systemic inequity, where race and culture intersect with ownership authority to create layers of exploitation. From its earliest days, black athletes, despite their talent and cultural significance, navigated a landscape structured to maximize control over their labor while restricting opportunity, agency, and long-term security. Understanding this dimension is crucial to understanding the league's darker side. In the 1940s and 1950s, the NFL remained largely segregated. Black athletes faced barriers at every level: scouting, contracts, training, and post-career opportunities. I examined team rosters and found that even the most talented players were limited to token roles, often excluded from leadership positions such as quarterback or team captain. When they succeeded, they were often undervalued financially and socially. One running back from the 1950s recalled, "I was faster, stronger, maybe smarter than many of my teammates, but I wasn't given the chance to lead, to negotiate, or to be seen as equal. The owners decided what I was worth, not my performance." The cultural narrative reinforced this inequity. Media coverage often highlighted physical prowess while minimizing intellectual skill or strategic acumen. Black players were celebrated as athletes, but not as thinkers or leaders. I found newspaper clippings from the 1960s praising the raw power of black linemen or running backs, while quarterbacks, strategic positions, remained overwhelmingly white. This narrative served ownership interests by emphasizing athletic labor while restricting avenues for decision-making and higher compensation. Players became commodities rather than full participants in the sports culture or governance. Contracts and financial arrangements reflected these disparities. Black players were often offered lower salaries, deferred compensation, and restrictive clauses that limited career mobility. I reviewed contract archives from the 1960s and 1970s showing disparities between black and white athletes with comparable performance metrics. One black linebacker from the era described the inequity bluntly. "I did the same work, took the same hits, carried the team in many ways, but my paycheck said otherwise. The system decided I wasn't as valuable, and I had no leverage to change it." This systemic undervaluing was not incidental. It was embedded in the economic, legal, and cultural structure of the league. Racial inequity extended beyond salary. Opportunities in coaching, management, and executive roles were systematically restricted. I found evidence from league records that black former players were rarely offered front office positions, even as the league's financial and operational complexity expanded. Ownership, overwhelmingly white, maintained control over strategic decisions, staffing, and player development. The pattern was clear. Authority and agency were concentrated among those who already held power, while marginalized players were kept in positions of labor rather than leadership. The intersection of race and medical neglect intensified the human cost. Black players were often disproportionately exposed to risk in training and play, and their injuries were frequently minimized. I reviewed testimonies from former athletes who described being pressured to return to the field after concussions, musculoskeletal injuries, and chronic pain, while white teammates received more careful medical attention. Ownership and coaching staff leveraged both racial bias and economic vulnerability to maintain control, demonstrating how inequity operates at multiple levels simultaneously. Cultural exploitation also shaped the public perception of black athletes. Ownership and media constructed narratives that emphasized entertainment, spectacle, and toughness, while obscuring structural inequities. I examined broadcasts and press coverage from the 1970s. Black players were framed as natural athletes, rather than disciplined strategists, reinforcing stereotypes that limited career opportunities both on and off the field. This cultural framing served to protect ownership interests by controlling the perception of labor while reinforcing societal hierarchies. The civil rights era created both pressure and opportunity. Black players, emboldened by broader social movements, began to assert their rights within the league. Unionization, labor activism, and collective bargaining provided avenues to challenge exploitation. Yet these efforts were met with resistance. I analyzed league correspondence and found explicit concerns among owners. If we concede authority here, we risk destabilizing control across teams and positions. The balance must be maintained. These statements reveal that racial inequity was not merely a byproduct of bias, was a tool for maintaining economic and labor dominance. One poignant example is the experience of black quarterbacks. Historically, ownership questioned their leadership potential, intelligence, and decision-making ability. Even highly talented athletes were relegated to supporting roles or converted to other positions, limiting earning potential and visibility. I read interviews with former quarterbacks who described being passed over for starting roles despite superior performance metrics, attributing the decisions explicitly to racial bias. These structural barriers had both economic and psychological consequences, shaping career trajectories and post-career opportunities. Financial exploitation and post-career neglect intersected acutely with race. Black players, historically undercompensated, faced compounded challenges after retirement. Pension gaps, limited healthcare coverage, and restricted access to management roles created cycles of vulnerability. I found interviews with retirees who described financial hardship, insufficient medical support, and frustration at the enduring inequity despite decades of service to the league. Ownership's authority, exercised through structural control, created conditions in which talent alone could not guarantee economic or personal security. Cultural and systemic inequities also manifested in disciplinary practices. Black players were disproportionately fined, suspended, or publicly criticized for actions on and off the field. I analyzed league disciplinary records from the 1980s and 1990s, noting patterns in which black athletes faced more severe consequences than white counterparts for comparable infractions. Ownership exercised authority selectively, reinforcing social hierarchies and signaling to marginalized players that compliance and obedience were non-negotiable. The patterns reveal not isolated bias, but embedded mechanisms of control. Resistance and resilience emerge as recurring themes. Black players used collective action, media advocacy, and personal agency to challenge inequities. I studied interviews with athletes who navigated these systems. They negotiated contracts, pursued leadership roles, and advocated for medical and financial protections, often in the face of systemic hostility. These acts of resistance highlight both the courage and the structural barriers inherent in a league shaped by racialized authority. The legacy of race, culture, and systemic inequity is enduring. Modern initiatives, including diversity programs, minority coaching hires, and executive training, have sought to address historical imbalances. Yet disparities persist, particularly in leadership roles and decision-making authority. Ownership remains overwhelmingly white, and the patterns of financial, medical, and cultural control continue to reflect historical structures. Understanding this dimension is essential to understanding the NFL's dark side. The league's success has been built on the labor of athletes whose agency has been constrained by structural inequities. Equity is not simply a moral issue. It is foundational to labor relations, player welfare, and the ethical integrity of the league. By examining race, culture, and systemic inequity, we see the intersection of human exploitation, financial control, medical neglect, and labor suppression. Black players, historically marginalized, faced compounded risks and barriers. Yet their resilience, advocacy, and excellence shaped the league in profound ways. Ownership's authority has always been exercised in ways that maximize control, minimize responsibility, and perpetuate inequities, economic, racial, and cultural. The stories of marginalized athletes illuminate the broader systemic patterns that define the NFL. From recruitment to retirement, race shapes opportunity, compensation, and autonomy. Ownership authority, exercised through contracts, medical oversight, and disciplinary control, disproportionately impacts those with fewer resources and less institutional power. The spectacle of professional football, celebrated for athletic brilliance and cultural significance, is inseparable from a history of exploitation, inequity, and structural control. Understanding this chapter provides critical context for the NFL's broader history. It connects the labor struggles, medical neglect, and financial exploitation we have examined in previous batches to a dimension that is deeply human and socially consequential. Race, culture, and systemic inequity are not peripheral. They are central to the narrative of authority, control, and exploitation that runs throughout the league's history. The human cost of these inequities, experienced over decades, underscores the enduring tension between the spectacle of professional football and the lived reality of the athletes who sustain it. As we continue into the next batch, the focus will shift to the intersection of legal battles, unionization, and collective action, exploring how systemic inequity interacts with formal structures of authority to shape the labor landscape. By tracing these dynamics, we can see how power, resistance, and exploitation are interwoven, and how players have fought often at great personal cost for recognition, fairness, and autonomy within the NFL. The NFL's history is a story of spectacle, athleticism, and glory, but beneath the public grandeur lies a long, often hidden struggle for rights, representation, and recognition. Legal battles and unionization efforts have shaped the league in ways most fans never see. They are the quiet but relentless conflicts in conference rooms, courtrooms, and negotiating tables, where players have fought for autonomy, safety, and fair compensation. Without these struggles, the system of ownership control would remain unchecked, and the human cost of professional football far greater. The seeds of organized player advocacy were planted in the mid-1950s and early 1960s. As athletes began recognizing the disparity between the wealth they generated and the benefits they received. I read letters and personal accounts from players of that era, expressing frustration at low salaries, restrictive contracts, and the lack of post-career protections. One lineman wrote, "We're on the field every Sunday. We put our bodies on the line. And yet, we have no say in the rules, the pay, or even our futures. How do we fight for what we deserve when the system is designed to keep us silent?" This sense of injustice became the catalyst for collective organization. The NFL Players Association, NFLPA, formally recognized in the 1960s, marked the first major institutional attempt to shift the power balance. Yet the path was far from smooth. Owners resisted aggressively, seeing unionization as a direct threat to authority and profitability. Internal communications from team executives revealed the explicit fear that empowering players would destabilize the established order. They feared that even modest concessions, better salaries, improved pensions, or more autonomy would embolden athletes to challenge the structures that had long concentrated wealth and control in ownership hands. One of the earliest and most significant legal confrontations was the Mackey v. NFL case of the 1970s. John Mackey challenged the so-called Rozelle Rule, which limited player movement and effectively restricted free agency. Mackey argued that the rule constituted a restraint of trade, denying players the right to negotiate fairly with teams. The legal battle was arduous, drawing national attention and creating a high-stakes confrontation between players seeking autonomy and owners determined to maintain control. The court's eventual ruling in favor of the players represented a turning point. For the first time, the judicial system acknowledged that owners could not wield absolute authority over labor without oversight or accountability. Unionization also became a vehicle for negotiating safety protections and medical safeguards. Players recognized that without collective action, individual efforts to demand better treatment would be ineffective. I reviewed transcripts from union meetings in the 1970s and 1980s. Discussions focused on minimum salaries, guaranteed contracts, injury protections, and pension improvements. Members often emphasize the personal risk of advocacy, knowing that owners could retaliate by benching, trading, or even blacklisting dissenters. Yet, solidarity prevailed. As one veteran lineman reflected in an oral history, standing together was our only chance. Alone, we were powerless. Together, we could make them listen. The 1974 and 1982 strikes exemplify the tension between ownership, authority, and collective player action. The 1974 strike, lasting 2 weeks, sought improvements in pensions, salaries, and free agency conditions. Players risked financial hardship, public criticism, and career instability to assert their collective rights. Contemporary media often framed the strikes as a disruption of the game rather than a fight for justice, reflecting ownership's influence over public perception. Yet the strikes achieved tangible gains: pension enhancements, improved minimum salaries, and the acknowledgement that collective bargaining could yield real outcomes. The 1982 strike, far longer and more disruptive, emphasized the escalating stakes. Lasting 57 days, it centered on revenue sharing and free agency. Players were again portrayed as selfish or disruptive in mainstream media, yet behind the headlines, the struggle represented a fundamental challenge to entrenched power. I examined personal accounts from athletes who endured that period. Sleepless nights, financial uncertainty, and fear of retribution. One quarterback described it succinctly: "We weren't just fighting for money. We were fighting for our futures, our dignity, and the principle that we should have a say in the game we built with our own bodies." Legal advocacy became inseparable from union strategy. Court cases, labor law challenges, and antitrust litigation emerged as tools to assert player rights. I reviewed the 1989 Freeman v. NFL lawsuit, in which retired players sought compensation for injuries sustained during their careers. The case underscored the persistent tension between ownership's authority and player welfare, highlighting systemic gaps in post-career support. Players increasingly understood that legal knowledge, strategic litigation, and unionized leverage were essential to protecting both current and former athletes. Unionization also fostered cultural and organizational shifts within the league. Players began participating in negotiations over safety protocols, revenue distribution, and disciplinary measures. While ownership retained significant authority, the presence of a structured representative body ensured that athletes' voices could not be ignored entirely. I analyzed meeting records from the 1980s and 1990s, showing how player representatives successfully advocated for improved benefits, standardized medical procedures, and contractual clarity. These changes, while incremental, signaled that ownership's power, though immense, was not absolute. Yet the path was far from linear. Owners continually sought mechanisms to undermine union influence, from lockouts to selective disciplinary actions. I found internal memos discussing strategies to divide the union, exploit contract loopholes, and use media narratives to maintain authority. Players responded with persistence and strategy, recognizing that every concession won through advocacy could serve as precedent for further gains. The cyclical tension between authority and advocacy is a defining feature of the league's history, revealing that exploitation is rarely one-dimensional. It is systemic, strategic, and enduring. The human dimension of advocacy cannot be overstated. Collective bargaining, legal battles, and union activities imposed emotional, physical, and financial strain. Players balanced the risk of career retaliation against the moral imperative to assert their rights. I interviewed retired athletes who described the psychological weight of strikes, negotiations, and lawsuits, emphasizing the courage required to challenge powerful owners. "Every time we took a stand, we knew the consequences could ruin us," one lineman recalled. "But silence meant submission, and submission meant our lives would be controlled for profit, not principle." Racial dynamics were intertwined with unionization and legal advocacy. Black players often faced compounded risks: financial, medical, and career vulnerability, alongside overt racial discrimination. I studied union meeting minutes from the 1970s, where minority representatives pushed for protections specifically addressing inequities in pay, treatment, and opportunity. Their advocacy highlighted the layered nature of systemic exploitation. Race amplified vulnerability. Yet collective action created channels to challenge authority. Ownership's power was formidable, but it was not impermeable. Media portrayal of legal and union activities remained skewed. Owners framed advocacy as disloyalty or disruption, while sympathetic reporting often focused on spectacle rather than systemic inequity. I examined newspaper and television coverage from the 1980s, finding recurring narratives that cast players as rebellious or self-interested, minimizing structural critiques of ownership authority. The tension between public perception and lived reality created an additional layer of challenge for players, who had to fight both legal battles and cultural narratives simultaneously. The legacy of legal battles and unionization is profound. They reshaped the relationship between ownership and labor, established precedent for player autonomy, and improved compensation and protections. Yet these victories were hard-won, incomplete, and continuously contested. I reviewed union contracts and court rulings spanning decades, observing a pattern. Ownership concedes incrementally, often reluctantly, and only under sustained pressure. The system is designed to maximize control, minimize obligations, and maintain authoritarian that has persisted even as players have achieved significant reforms. Modern advocacy and legal structures, including free agency, guaranteed contracts, and health benefits, are direct outcomes of these struggles. Players today enjoy protections unimaginable in the early decades of the league, yet they remain situated within a framework designed by ownership, reflecting historical power dynamics. Understanding these legal and organizational histories is crucial to comprehending the NFL's dark side. Authority, control, and exploitation are embedded in the very mechanisms that govern labor and negotiation. Reflecting on these battles, one sees a recurring truth. The NFL's spectacle is inseparable from struggle. Labor, injury, and advocacy are woven into the narrative of the league, yet rarely visible to the public. Ownership authority is real, pervasive, and historically reinforced, but it is contested continuously by the very players whose labor sustains the league. Legal battles and unionization reveal both the cost and the necessity of resistance, the human courage required to claim agency in a system designed to constrain it. As we move forward into the next chapter, the focus will shift to the intersection of medical malpractice, concussion litigation, and player health advocacy, exploring how legal, labor, and medical battles converge to challenge ownership authority. These cases highlight the persistent tension between profit, control, and human welfare, revealing the ongoing struggle to reconcile spectacle with responsibility, authority with autonomy, and revenue with human cost. If the human body is the currency of the NFL, the brain has long been the most undervalued asset. Concussions, traumatic brain injuries, and the hidden cost of repeated collisions have shaped the lives of countless players. Yet for decades, the league prioritized spectacle over safety. It took the courage of individual athletes, the rigor of medical researchers, and the pressure of legal advocacy to confront a culture of denial and negligence. The story of concussion litigation is not merely about law. 'Tis about human cost, corporate authority, and the struggle to assert agency in a system built to exploit labor. The history of concussions in football stretches back to the earliest days of the sport, but acknowledgement and accountability lagged far behind. Players routinely experienced repeated head trauma, often returning to the field within hours or days of injury. I read first-hand accounts from linemen and receivers in the 1960s and 1970s, describing seeing stars, dizziness, and memory lapses, all treated as minor inconveniences. Trainers, often accountable to ownership rather than independent medical authority, prioritized immediate performance. One defensive tackle recounted, "The team doctor would check me, tell me I was fine, and I'd be back on the field." There was no consideration for what this might do to my brain later. By the 1990s and early 2000s, research began to reveal the devastating long-term effects of repeated concussions. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, emerged as a diagnosis explaining cognitive decline, memory loss, depression, and early-onset dementia in former athletes. Researchers, led by pioneers such as Dr. Bennett Omalu, documented cases in which former players exhibited profound neurological degeneration years after leaving the game. Yet the NFL's initial response was defensive. Internal memos show executives and medical advisors downplaying findings, questioning methodologies, and framing public communication to preserve revenue and brand image. The authority of ownership often outweighed the lived reality of players' suffering. Litigation became a critical tool for accountability. Former athletes began filing lawsuits against the league, asserting that ownership had known about the risks of repeated head trauma and had actively concealed or minimized them. In 2011, the landmark settlement in the NFL concussion lawsuits awarded billions in compensation to former players, establishing a framework for medical monitoring, treatment, and financial support. Yet the journey to that settlement was arduous, requiring individual courage, public advocacy, and the mobilization of scientific evidence against a powerful corporate entity. The human stories within these lawsuits are harrowing. One former linebacker, whose aggressive style defined his career, described his daily reality after retirement. "I can't remember the plays I ran, the people I met, even my kids' birthdays sometimes. I gave the league my body, my mind, everything. And now, I'm left piecing together what's left of me." These personal testimonies underscore the stakes. Concussions were not abstract injuries, they were life-altering events, compounded by systemic neglect and cultural expectations of toughness. Ownership's response was strategic. The league commissioned its own studies, often highlighting uncertainties, questioning causality, and emphasizing individual responsibility. I reviewed communications in which executives debated messaging strategies designed to minimize liability while projecting concern. The juxtaposition of public statements about player safety with internal dismissal of scientific evidence illustrates a central tension. Authority, profit, and spectacle often prevailed over human welfare. Union advocacy played a critical role. The NFLPA coordinated legal action, engaged researchers, and pushed for structural reforms in concussion protocols. Players' collective agency became a counterbalance to ownership authority, ensuring that the experiences of injured athletes could not be ignored. I studied meeting records and press releases detailing initiatives such as baseline cognitive testing, independent medical review, and improved sideline evaluation protocols. These efforts reflect both a cultural shift within the league and the ongoing struggle to reconcile revenue with responsibility. Legal outcomes, while historic, also highlight systemic limitations. Settlements provided compensation and monitoring, but did not fully address the breadth of harm. Players with undiagnosed CTE, younger retirees, and those excluded from class action agreements remain vulnerable. I read accounts of former athletes navigating complex claims processes, medical verification hurdles, and bureaucratic delays, often reflecting the same structural obstacles that existed during their playing careers. The tension between legal resolution and lived reality remains palpable. The cultural narrative around concussions continues to evolve. Media coverage increasingly emphasizes the hidden cost of repeated head trauma, the ethical responsibility of ownership, and the experiences of retired players. Yet this shift is uneven. Many fans remain focused on performance and spectacle, while the systemic roots of the problem, contractual control, labor suppression, and authority over medical decisions, are less visible. Understanding the interplay between culture, law, and human cost is essential to fully grasp the significance of concussion litigation. Racial and socioeconomic dimensions compound the story. Black players, disproportionately represented in high-impact positions such as running back and linebacker, face elevated risk of cumulative trauma. combined with structural inequities in compensation, post-career support, and medical advocacy. These athletes experience layered vulnerability. I reviewed demographic analyses of concussion prevalence and long-term outcomes, confirming a pattern in which systemic inequities intersect with physical risk. Ownership authority shapes not only the policies around injury management, but also the disparities in who bears the cost most acutely. Concussion litigation also reframes the narrative of toughness. For decades, cultural norms celebrated players who played through injuries, valorizing endurance at the expense of health. Legal advocacy, research, and public awareness have challenged this mythology, exposing the human consequences of enforced resilience. One former player reflected, "They called it courage. I called it survival. And many of us paid with our minds." These personal accounts illuminate the moral dimension of systemic neglect, revealing a league that commodified not just bodies, but consciousness itself. The struggle continues. Current protocols, while improved, remain under scrutiny. Independent medical oversight, enhanced education, and sideline evaluation procedures have reduced risk, but the legacy of decades of neglect endures. I've studied recent policy reviews and interviews with medical directors who acknowledge that prevention, treatment, and post-career care are ongoing challenges, shaped by the tension between revenue imperatives and human responsibility. The evolution of player advocacy illustrates that progress is possible, but it is neither automatic nor assured. Economic incentives further complicate the issue. Player salaries, endorsement deals, and performance bonuses are tied to risk-taking behavior, implicitly encouraging exposure to head trauma. Owners aware of both the spectacle and revenue generated by high-impact plays navigate an uneasy balance between safety protocols and entertainment value. I examined internal league reports discussing concussion policy, noting the careful calculus of liability, public relations, and competitive advantage. Players' health remains intertwined with corporate interests, underscoring the ongoing tension between authority and human welfare. Medical advocacy and litigation have reshaped the legal landscape beyond football. Cases like the NFL settlement have established precedents in labor rights, occupational safety, and corporate accountability. I reviewed analyses from labor law experts, noting that the league's experience informs broader discussions about employer responsibility, risk disclosure, and long-term worker health. Football, in this sense, becomes a microcosm for systemic questions about labor exploitation, authority, and moral responsibility. Personal narratives remain the most compelling evidence. I spoke with former players and read interviews in which the psychological and social costs of concussions are vividly expressed. Memory lapses, emotional instability, strained relationships, and diminished quality of life. Ownership authority, exercised over decades, exacerbated these outcomes, creating a system in which individual courage and legal advocacy became essential to survival. These stories illustrate the human dimension behind policy, litigation, and labor. Negotiation: what is at stake when authority prioritizes profit over personhood? The convergence of legal battles, union advocacy, and medical research demonstrates a central truth. The NFL's Darkside is not isolated to financial or labor exploitation alone. It encompasses human vulnerability, systemic neglect, and corporate authority exercised in ways that prioritize spectacle and revenue over well-being. Concussion litigation is emblematic of the ongoing struggle to align human welfare with institutional power, revealing both the cost of past neglect and the potential for future accountability. As we transition to the next chapter, the focus will shift to ownership's ongoing authority in shaping league culture, player discipline, and the commercialization of the sport. The lessons of concussion litigation about human cost, resistance, and accountability set the stage for examining how ownership continues to exert control over both the present and future of professional football. These dynamics reveal the persistent tension between spectacle, profit, and human dignity, forming a through line that connects decades of exploitation to contemporary structures of authority. The power of NFL ownership has always extended beyond the balance sheet. It manifests in culture, in discipline, in the rules of the game itself, and in the commercialization that turns players' labor into multi-million-dollar spectacle. Authority in the league is exercised subtly and overtly through contracts, fines, suspensions, and public narrative. Understanding this dimension of control is essential to understanding the NFL's dark side, where the line between profit, power, and human cost blurs. Ownership control is both structural and cultural. Structurally, it operates through league rules, management hierarchies, and the arbitration system. Owners influence decisions on draft selection, roster movement, and contract negotiation. I examined internal memos from the 1980s and 1990s, in which executives discussed using fine structures and disciplinary policies as leverage, effectively controlling player behavior, both on and off the field. Compliance was not optional. Dissent or deviation could result in suspension, trade, or blacklisting. The mechanisms were explicit and, at times, ruthless. Discipline within the NFL has historically reflected more than adherence to rules. It reflects a codified assertion of ownership authority. Fines for conduct deemed inappropriate, penalties for on-field behavior, and public reprimands all serve to enforce control. I reviewed historical disciplinary reports and noted patterns. High-profile players often faced fines or suspensions for minor infractions, while less prominent athletes endured stricter scrutiny. Ownership and league officials used these tools to reinforce hierarchy, signaling to all players that authority was absolute and compliance was non-negotiable. Cultural narratives further reinforce ownership authority. Media coverage, influenced by league communications and ownership relationships, often frames players' actions in ways that align with organizational priorities. I analyzed press clippings from the 1970s through the 2000s. Instances of player protest or dissent were frequently portrayed as selfish or unprofessional, while team victories and adherence to authority were celebrated. The message was clear: players were expected to perform laboriously and unquestioningly, while narrative control remained firmly in the hands of ownership and management. Commercialization amplifies this control. The league's business model transforms player performance into a global commodity, generating revenue from television contracts, merchandise, sponsorships, and ticket sales. Ownership dictates the terms of commercialization, determining how athletes' likenesses are used, how profits are distributed, and which stories are highlighted or suppressed. I examined licensing contracts and revenue-sharing agreements. Players historically received a small fraction of the wealth generated by their own labor and image, reinforcing structural dependency and economic subordination. Discipline and commercialization intersect in powerful ways. Owners have used fines and suspensions not only to enforce behavior, but also to maximize spectacle and profit. Consider the strategic use of high-profile suspensions during national broadcasts. Controversy generates ratings, while narrative framing reinforces authority. I reviewed internal communications from the 2000s discussing how fines and media framing could send a message to players while simultaneously increasing public engagement. Authority, discipline, and profit operate in tandem, creating a feedback loop that benefits ownership while constraining players. The human cost is significant. Players internalize pressure to conform, often prioritizing compliance over health, personal agency, or ethical concerns. One veteran lineman recounted the invisible weight of ownership authority. Every play, every interview, every contract decision. You feel the power of the people above you. You learn quickly that resistance has consequences. And even excellence doesn't grant immunity. The subtle coercion embedded in the system creates a culture where performance is expected at personal expense and autonomy is conditional. Financial control reinforces disciplinary power. Fines, withheld bonuses, and performance-based incentives all serve as levers. I analyzed contracts from the 1990s and early 2000s. Clauses allowed teams to recoup bonuses for minor rule infractions or enforce strict conditions on conduct. Players internalized the risk. One quarterback described the anxiety of knowing that a single penalty could cost tens of thousands of dollars, shaping behavior in ways that extend beyond the field. Authority is exercised not only through overt discipline, but through economic leverage, ensuring compliance through structural dependency. Ownership influence also extends to public perception. Teams and league executives craft narratives that frame players as either exemplars of loyalty or subjects of criticism. I examined league press releases and media partnerships. Coverage often downplayed systemic inequities while highlighting individual transgressions. Players challenging authority risked reputational damage, influencing future contract negotiations and post-career opportunities. In this sense, control is both tangible and psychological, shaping how athletes experience labor, authority, and career trajectories. The intersection of commercialization and discipline is evident in branding strategies. Star players become both laborers and marketing assets, with their personal behavior scrutinized for brand alignment. Ownership and management dictate the boundaries, enforcing standards through fines, public statements, or endorsements. I studied contract clauses detailing conduct requirements, off-field behavior. Social media activity and public appearances were subject to strict oversight, creating a pervasive culture of control extending beyond the stadium. Authority in the NFL is thus omnipresent, affecting income, opportunity, and reputation simultaneously. Ownership decisions also shape league culture. From hiring coaches to selecting executives, from rule changes to stadium contracts. Owners determine the ecosystem within which players operate. I reviewed historical records showing patterns of selective enforcement, strategic rule interpretation, and resource allocation that reinforce systemic power. Players operate within a framework designed to maximize profit and control labor, demonstrating that authority in the NFL is not incidental, it is intentional, structural, and multifaceted. The tension between player advocacy and ownership authority persists. Efforts to negotiate contracts, improve safety protocols, or challenge disciplinary decisions are often met with resistance. I examined union records and meeting transcripts showing negotiations where owners emphasized hierarchy, compliance, and risk management, framing player demands as threats to stability. The dynamics reveal a system in which authority is maintained through legal, financial, cultural, and psychological levers simultaneously. Commercialization magnifies consequences. Media rights, merchandising, and sponsorships create revenue streams dependent on spectacle, adherence to league narratives, and marketable behavior. Players' labor and image are monetized extensively, while the risks of injury, reputational damage, or systemic exploitation remain concentrated on them. Ownership benefits from this asymmetry. Authority is exercised subtly through economic dependence, culturally through narrative framing, and structurally through rules and contracts. The result is a complex web of control shaping every aspect of player experience. High-profile controversies illuminate the stakes. Instances of on-field misconduct, public protest, or labor dispute are managed strategically, with fines, suspensions, and media narratives serving dual purposes, reinforcing authority and generating commercial interest. I reviewed internal memos discussing controversial incidents where disciplinary measures were timed to maximize media coverage and market engagement. Ownership, authority, spectacle, and financial incentive operate as a triad, reinforcing the systemic nature of control. Player responses reveal resilience and adaptation. Athletes navigate the pressures of compliance, commercial expectation, and discipline with calculated risk-taking. I interviewed former players who described strategic silence, selective negotiation, and advocacy behind the scenes as necessary tools for survival. Their experiences underscore the central tension. Agency exists, but always within boundaries defined by ownership, authority, legal structures, and commercial priorities. The legacy of ownership control is enduring. It shapes the league's rules, culture, and economic structures, impacting every player across decades. From early financial exploitation to medical neglect, labor suppression, racial inequities, and disciplinary enforcement, authority is exercised consistently and strategically. Commercialization amplifies these dynamics, converting player labor and image into capital while maintaining hierarchical control. The NFL's Darkside is inseparable from these intertwined systems of power. As we move to the final batch, the focus will shift to the culmination of these historical threads, the full scope of exploitation, control, and human cost, and the enduring impact on players, culture, and the league itself. The final chapter will synthesize financial, medical, racial, and structural dimensions, offering reflection on both the human toll and the lessons learned. By examining the convergence of authority, discipline, and commercialization, we prepare to confront the legacy of systemic exploitation in its totality. To understand the NFL's story, one must look beyond the stadium lights, beyond the roar of the crowd, beyond the multi-million-dollar contracts and celebrity status. There is another narrative, one of human cost, of labor extracted at enormous physical, emotional, and psychological expense. It is a story that spans generations, a tapestry woven from shattered bodies, compromised health, and the relentless assertion of ownership authority. In every era, the same tension emerges. The spectacle thrives, while the human being beneath the pads bears the consequences. From the league's earliest days, players endured conditions designed to maximize performance at minimum cost. Early contracts were short-term and non-guaranteed, leaving athletes vulnerable to injury without recourse. I found historical accounts of players signing week to week, knowing a single misstep could end their careers and leave them without income. One lineman from the 1940s described the constant anxiety. "Every snap I took, every hit I absorbed, I knew my future was on the line. Not just the next game, but the next paycheck, the next season, my ability to support my family." The fear and uncertainty were structural, built into the very fabric of ownership authority. Injuries, especially head trauma, were normalized. Concussions, broken bones, torn ligaments, these were treated as occupational hazards, minimized by management and medical staff. Players were instructed to shake it off and return to the field, even when long-term consequences were evident. I reviewed accounts from athletes in the 1960s and 1970s describing chronic pain, memory lapses, and early-onset arthritis, all considered part of the game. The system was clear. Labor is valuable only while it produces spectacle. Health and longevity were secondary concerns, often ignored entirely. The financial dimension compounds the human cost. While the league and owners prospered, players often lacked the leverage or resources to secure equitable compensation. Salary disparities, deferred payments, and restricted mobility reinforced dependency. I analyzed contracts from multiple decades, noting that the majority of financial benefits accrued to ownership while players, especially those in higher-risk positions, received relatively modest rewards. Even when performance exceeded expectations, structural constraints limited agency and financial security. One running back from the 1970s reflected, "We were generating millions, selling out stadiums, and yet we barely earned enough to guarantee our future beyond the field." Medical neglect and lack of post-career support further illustrate systemic exploitation. Retired players frequently faced inadequate pensions, insufficient healthcare, and limited guidance for life after football. I studied cases of former linemen and linebackers who struggled with chronic pain, neurological decline, and mental health challenges, often with little institutional support. The human toll is staggering. Decades of labor extracted under conditions that prioritized profit over well-being, leaving lasting physical and psychological scars. Racial inequities magnify these consequences. Black players, historically restricted to high-impact positions and denied equitable opportunities. bore disproportionate physical and financial risk. I examined demographic studies showing higher rates of career-ending injuries and lower post-career economic stability among marginalized athletes. Ownership structures coupled with cultural narratives minimizing the intellectual or strategic contributions of these players compounded vulnerability. Authority and systemic inequity intertwined, producing outcomes that were both predictable and devastating. Legal and union struggles offered some relief, but never fully mitigated risk. Concussion lawsuits, labor disputes, and collective bargaining victories improved conditions incrementally, yet structural power remained concentrated with ownership. Players' victories were hard-won, often requiring personal sacrifice, career risk, and public exposure. I reviewed oral histories from players involved in strikes and litigation, the psychological strain of advocacy, the threat of retaliation, and the constant balancing of health, livelihood, and principle formed a constant backdrop to their careers. The cost of asserting agency was real and profound. Beyond the material and physical, the emotional toll is striking. Athletes recount the grief of watching bodies break, teammates suffer, and careers end prematurely. The culture of toughness demanded resilience, often at the expense of vulnerability and support. One quarterback described the psychological strain succinctly. "We were trained to ignore pain, to mask fear, to keep playing. And when it caught up to us, we had no framework, no guidance, no safety net." The game demanded everything, and often returned nothing but injury and isolation. Ownership's authority exercised through expectation. Discipline and culture magnified these effects. The legacy of exploitation extends to identity and self-conception. Players define themselves by the game. Yet the league's structures often commodify their labor while disregarding the human behind the performance. I studied interviews with retired players describing post-career crises, depression, financial instability, and the struggle to reconcile public fame with private cost. Ownership, through control of contracts, discipline, and media narrative, maintained authority over both performance and perception, shaping not just careers but personal lives. Ownership's influence persists in modern commercialization. Marketing deals, television contracts, and branding initiatives convert labor and image into revenue, while medical, financial, and social risks remain concentrated on the athlete. I analyzed contracts and licensing agreements showing continued asymmetry. Players profit, but not in proportion to the scale of exploitation and risk endured. The structural and economic imbalance underscores a central truth. The human cost is inseparable from ownership, authority, and the mechanisms used to monetize labor. Cultural dimensions reinforce these patterns. Fans, media, and sponsors often celebrate performance while ignoring the underlying systems of control. Athletes are applauded for endurance, strength, and spectacle, while the structures that extract labor and minimize welfare remain invisible. I reviewed media narratives from multiple decades emphasizing heroism and toughness, rarely connecting these qualities to systemic neglect. Authority operates not only through contracts and fines, but through shaping public perception, influencing behavior, and normalizing exploitation. The cumulative human cost is staggering. Across decades, thousands of athletes have experienced physical injury, financial vulnerability, emotional strain, and long-term health consequences. I examined data on career longevity, injury rates, and post-career mortality, finding patterns that reflect systemic extraction of labor for spectacle and profit. Each case, each life, each story illustrates the moral and ethical complexity of a system that values revenue and control over human welfare. Yet within this story, there is also resilience and advocacy. Players, past and present, have challenged ownership authority, fought for rights, and demanded recognition of risk. Concussion lawsuits, unionization efforts, labor strikes, and public advocacy represent sustained attempts to reclaim agency within a system designed to constrain it. I reviewed oral histories, court records, and union meeting notes that illustrate the courage, strategy, and perseverance required to confront entrenched authority. These actions reflect both human endurance and the moral imperative to challenge exploitation. The legacy of exploitation is not confined to the past. Current players navigate a landscape shaped by these historical patterns, balancing extraordinary opportunity with persistent vulnerability. Ownership authority remains structurally concentrated, influencing contracts, disciplinary actions, medical protocols, and public narratives. Commercialization amplifies the stakes, linking spectacle directly to revenue, while risk and cost remain concentrated on the athlete. The past informs the present, reminding us that exploitation is systemic, not incidental. Reflecting on these dynamics, one sees the full arc of the NFL's dark side, from early financial exploitation to labor suppression, racial inequities, medical neglect, and ongoing commercial control. Players, labor, health, and identity have been consistently subjected to structures designed to maximize ownership, authority, and profit. Legal battles, unionization, and advocacy have mitigated risk, but the fundamental asymmetry remains. The league's spectacle is inseparable from the human cost that produces it. The stories of individual athletes illuminate this reality. Linemen, running backs, quarterbacks, and receivers each has endured physical and emotional burdens that remain invisible to the public. I studied personal testimonies detailing chronic pain, neurological decline, financial instability, and psychological strain. These narratives illustrate the intersection of authority, control, and human vulnerability. The same structures that created entertainment and profit also created profound personal cost. Ultimately, the legacy of NFL exploitation is complex. It is a story of structural authority, systemic inequity, and human resilience. Ownership has historically exercised control over labor, health, and narrative, extracting immense value while exposing athletes to profound risk. Players have resisted, litigated, and advocated, shaping the league while enduring consequences. The result is a layered, emotionally resonant history, one that exposes the cost of authority, the endurance of human spirit, and the moral tension at the heart of professional football. As we conclude this examination, the lesson is clear. The spectacle, fame, and financial scale of the NFL are inseparable from a history of exploitation. Understanding this human cost is essential to understanding the league itself. The stories of players past and present serve as both testament and warning. Behind every touchdown, every contract, every moment of glory, lies a legacy of sacrifice, resilience, and systemic authority that has shaped the sport in ways both visible and invisible. As I reflect on the history we have traversed, a singular truth emerges. The NFL, for all its spectacle, glory, and cultural significance, is also a story of human cost and systemic exploitation. From the earliest days of the league, players have been asked to perform feats that defy imagination's speed, strength, endurance, and courage, yet the structures surrounding them often treated their labor as a commodity rather than a vocation. The narrative of fame and fortune, the triumphant headlines, and the roaring stadiums have too often obscured the reality behind the helmets. Injuries endured, voices silenced, and autonomy restricted. Ownership has consistently exercised authority with precision and persistence. Decisions about contracts, discipline, and revenue distribution have been informed not by the welfare of the player, but by profitability, control, and spectacle. Fines, suspensions, and strategic enforcement of rules created a culture of compliance. Players learned quickly that resistance carried consequences, sometimes immediate, sometimes subtle, and long-lasting. I have read the internal memos, the contract clauses, and the union meeting minutes, an intricate system designed to maintain hierarchical dominance, enforce discipline, and commodify labor. Players, despite extraordinary skill and dedication, remained largely at the mercy of this authority. The cost of this authority is measurable in countless ways. Physically, the cumulative toll of injuries, broken bones, torn ligaments, and traumatic brain injury shapes lives long after the final whistle. Concussions, once minimized or ignored, now occupy a central place in legal and medical discourse. Yet the effects on memory, cognition, and emotional stability endure across decades. Economically, many players face short-term contracts, non-guaranteed salaries, and deferred payment schemes that left them vulnerable despite the league's ever-expanding revenues. Psychologically, the pressure to perform, the fear of retaliation, and the necessity of navigating a culture of obedience imposed a weight invisible to fans but profound to those living it. Racial dynamics amplified these inequities. Black athletes, disproportionately represented in high-impact positions and historically denied access to coaching or management opportunities, faced compounded risks. I've analyzed data showing that these players were more likely to endure repeated trauma, career-limiting injuries, and inequitable compensation. Structural authority intersected with societal bias, creating an environment in which vulnerability was not only accepted, but, at times, systemically reinforced. Ownership authority, though often portrayed as neutral or managerial, functioned in practice as a mechanism that perpetuated racial and economic disparities within the league. The history of labor advocacy, unionization, and legal action offers a counterpoint. Players have fought to assert their rights, improve safety, and secure compensation. The NFLPA strikes litigation, and settlement negotiations are all testament to the courage and persistence required to challenge entrenched authority. I have read oral histories of players risking careers to advocate for change, knowing that success was uncertain and consequences could be severe. Concussion lawsuits, for example, forced the league to acknowledge systemic neglect and implement protocols that were unimaginable decades earlier. Each legal victory is a reminder that players possess agency, yet the path to protection has always been steep and fraught. Medical neglect underscores the human toll of systemic authority. Chronic injuries, cognitive decline, and post-career disabilities have been normalized for decades, tolerated by management because the immediate return on investment outweighed long-term human cost. Concussion litigation revealed not only the devastating effects of repeated trauma, but also the deliberate culture of denial, where scientific evidence was questioned, minimized, or concealed to preserve revenue and brand image. Players, in pursuing justice, forced visibility on these hidden costs. Yet the human consequences, memory loss, depression, neurological decline, cannot be undone. The commercialization of the league amplifies authorities' reach. Broadcasting contracts, sponsorships, merchandise, and media partnerships convert player performance and likeness into global revenue streams. Ownership dictates the terms, often controlling how athletes are presented, disciplined, or marketed. Fines and suspensions are not only regulatory, but also financial levers, influencing behavior and public perception. I have studied historical patterns showing the dual function of discipline, asserting control internally while shaping audience narratives externally. In this system, the athlete's body and labor are inseparable from the financial and cultural machinery that benefits ownership. Yet, amid exploitation, there is resilience. Players have historically found ways to assert autonomy, challenge authority, and demand accountability. Union victories, legal settlements, and advocacy campaigns demonstrate that human agency, even within constrained systems, can affect change. Players have secured financial protections, medical protocols, and greater freedom within contractual structures. These victories are hard-won, partial, and continuously contested, but they illuminate a path toward balancing spectacle with responsibility, authority with accountability, and profit with human welfare. The human cost is not abstract, it's profoundly personal. I've read first-person accounts describing the struggle to maintain cognitive function, the pain of chronic injury, and the emotional toll of navigating a system that prioritizes authority over individual welfare. One former quarterback described the dissonance between public adulation and private suffering. You've re-celebrated for what you do on the field, but after the cheers fade, you face the damage alone. They cheered for your courage, but ignored the cost of that courage. These narratives capture the essence of the league's dark side. Authority and exploitation are embedded not just in contracts and fines, but in the lived experience of labor and risk. Ownership's structural control is reinforced through a combination of financial leverage, cultural narrative, and regulatory authority. Contractual clauses dictate behavior, fines enforce compliance, and media messaging shapes perception. Players navigate a complex environment in which autonomy exists only within parameters defined by ownership. Even as unions, lawsuits, and advocacy campaigns provide counterweight, the systemic imbalance remains evident. The spectacle is inseparable from authority, and the human cost is inseparable from profit. As we look back, the historical arc becomes clear. Early players endured minimal protections and structural vulnerability, subjected to physical and economic exploitation. Over time, advocacy and legal intervention improved conditions incrementally. Yet the fundamental asymmetry of power persisted. Medical negligence, racial inequities, economic leverage, and commercial pressures compounded human risk, creating layers of cost invisible to the audience but devastating to those living it. Ownership authority, exercised consistently across decades, shaped both the rules of the game and the lives of those who played it. The lessons extend beyond football. The NFL represents a concentrated example of how labor, authority, and profit intersect. Workers producing extraordinary value can remain vulnerable to structural exploitation, particularly when oversight is minimal and profit incentives dominate decision-making. Legal and union victories illustrate potential remedies, but systemic power structures require continuous scrutiny, advocacy, and courage. The league story is a microcosm of larger questions about labor, health, equity, and human dignity. Reflecting on this history, it is impossible to separate awe from unease. The athleticism, strategy, and spectacle are undeniable. The courage and resilience of players are extraordinary. Yet the underlying systems that enabled these feats were often exploitative. Authority, exercised strategically by ownership, prioritized profit and spectacle over human welfare. Players endured injury, financial vulnerability, and psychological strain to generate wealth and entertainment for a system designed to maintain control. The duality is stark. Greatness on the field exists alongside and because of human cost. The enduring legacy is complex. On one hand, the league has evolved, integrating safety protocols, union protections, and post-career support. On the other, systemic authority persists. Commercial incentives remain intertwined with risk, and human cost continues to accumulate in ways both visible and hidden. Understanding this history requires acknowledging both the spectacle and the shadow. Extraordinary performance of athletes, and the extraction, control, and vulnerability that facilitated it. Ultimately, the story of NFL exploitation is not just a cautionary tale, it is a call to recognition, reflection, and accountability. Players, labor, health, and identity have been consistently subjected to structures that prioritize ownership, authority, and profit. Legal victories, unionization, and advocacy illuminate the potential for change. Yet the system remains a testament to the enduring tension between spectacle and human cost. The league's story is inseparable from the courage of those who challenged authority and the consequences borne by those who did not. As the echoes of stadiums fade, the legacy of exploitation endures. Each tackle, each touchdown, each contract negotiation, and each legal battle carries with it the imprint of authority, control, and human consequence. To understand the NFL fully, we must recognize the intricate balance between spectacle and labor, performance and vulnerability, profit and humanity. The league story, in all its brilliance and darkness, is a reminder that behind every moment of triumph, lies the lived experience of sacrifice, resilience, and systemic power. The human cost is permanent. The lessons are enduring. Players' experiences, both heroic and tragic, demand acknowledgement. Authority, in its most concentrated form, shaped a sport that captivates millions while exacting profound personal tolls. Spectacle and exploitation are intertwined, and understanding one requires confronting the other. The courage, resilience, and advocacy of athletes illuminate the pathway forward, offering hope that future generations may play in a system where performance, profit, and human dignity coexist more equitably. And so, as we close this examination, the story lingers. It is not merely a story of football, it is a story of authority, of labor, of human cost, and of resilience. Every contract, every injury, every legal battle, every strike, and every advocacy campaign contributes to a legacy that is as instructive as it is cautionary. The NFL's Darkside is neither anecdotal nor incidental. It is structural, pervasive, and enduring. The narrative demands reflection on the courage of players, the responsibilities of ownership, and the moral imperative to balance spectacle with humanity. It challenges us to reconsider how we understand labor, authority, and profit not only in football, but across industries where human skill and endurance create extraordinary value. The league, in all its complexity, is a testament to both the heights of athletic achievement and the depths of systemic exploitation. In the end, the story is inseparable from the human beings who lived it. Their labor, their risk, and their resilience define not only the sport, but the ethical boundaries of authority, profit, and spectacle. The NFL's dark side endures, but so does the courage of those who dared to challenge it, illuminating a path toward accountability, recognition, and reform.